He didn't even have the decency to lock the door. Sloane Mercer had spent 4 years rebuilding her life around two people: the man she planned to marry and the sister she'd sacrificed her 20s to protect. She walked into that penthouse bedroom with a glass of champagne and the particular kind of trust that only comes from never once imagining betrayal. What she found stopped her cold. Evan Cross, Mara, her ring on the nightstand like it had been set aside for the evening. Sloane didn't scream. She set the champagne glass down on the dresser, very carefully, and pulled the engagement ring off her finger. Then she threw it. Not at Evan, not at Mara. She threw it at the wall, heard it crack against the baseboard and skitter across the marble, and walked out. She was still walking when the first gunshot shattered the glass behind her. Before we go any further, if this is the kind of story that stops you cold, hit that subscribe button right now and turn on notifications. Drop your city and country in the comments below. I want to see exactly how far this story has traveled. And if you're already watching, hit that like button and stay with me. Because what happens next in Sloane Mercer's life will make you question everything you thought you knew about starting over. The party had been Evan's idea. He'd called it a milestone celebration, 6 months since the merger that made Cross Financial one of the 10 largest private equity firms in the city. 400 guests, open bar on 2 floors, a string quartet in the East Corridor that nobody was actually listening to because everyone was too busy networking, circling, and watching each other, the way wealthy people do at events where the real transactions happen in the margins. Sloane had worn the green dress. The one Evan said made her look appropriately impressive. She'd learned not to ask what that meant anymore. She'd spent the first 2 hours working the room in the way she always did, listening more than she spoke, remembering names, connecting people who had no idea they needed to meet each other, things she was best at, and the thing Evan had never once acknowledged directly, though he'd used it at every event they attended together for the past 4 years. He'd introduce her and then drift away, confident she would hold the space he'd left behind, warm the room, make everyone feel seen. She always did. It was around 10:30 when she noticed Mara wasn't in the main hall anymore. Her sister had arrived late, not unusual, and had spent the first hour near the bar, laughing too loudly at things that weren't particularly funny, the way she did when she was nervous, or when she'd already had too much before she walked through the door. Sloane had watched her from across the room without moving toward her, the way you monitor something you're no longer sure how to handle. Mara was 26, 6 years younger than Sloane, which meant she'd been 20 when their mother died, and Sloane had quietly restructured her own career. Her own apartment, her own savings to make sure Mara had what she needed to finish school. Mara had finished school. She'd also borrowed money twice. Since then, paid it back once and called only when she needed something. Sloane had stopped counting the specific instances because counting them made her angry, and being angry at Mara felt like being angry at something she'd already agreed to carry. When she noticed Mara was gone, she assumed she'd stepped out for air. She went to find Evan to let him know she was heading up to freshen up before the formal remarks. His assistant hadn't seen him. One of the junior partners thought he'd seen him go upstairs. Sloane took the private elevator to the penthouse suite. Evan kept for himself during these extended events. He called it a practical arrangement. She'd stopped examining it too closely. The door wasn't locked. She pushed it open and walked 3 steps into the room before her brain caught up with what her eyes were already delivering. The silence that followed lasted maybe 4 seconds. Then Mara said her name, and the sound of it, the specific way Mara said it, high and thin, like a child caught in something terrible, made something go hard and quiet in Sloane's chest. Evan said nothing. He sat up slowly, the way someone does when they're calculating their next move, rather than reacting from genuine shock. That calculation was the detail that stayed with her afterward. Not the fact of the betrayal, not even her sister's face. It was the way Evan looked at her and started calculating. Sloane walked to the dresser, set down the champagne glass she was somehow still holding, pulled off the ring. She could feel both of them watching her, could feel Mara starting to speak. Sloane, please. I can explain. It's not. And the absurdity of that particular sentence in that particular moment was almost funny. She threw the ring at the wall, then she walked out. She made it as far as the corridor outside the suite before her hands started shaking. Not from grief, more like the physical symptom of something massive and structural shifting inside her, not breaking. Exactly, but rearranging, reorganizing around a new truth. 4 years. She had given those two people 4 years and $300,000, and she'd never fully admitted to herself. And the specific kind of steadiness that only certain women learn to perform, because the people around them have never learned to hold their own weight. She stood in the corridor for a moment, with her back against the wall and her hands pressed flat against her thighs to stop the shaking, and she thought, I am not going back in there. Then the window at the end of the corridor disintegrated. The sound was enormous and immediate, not a single shot, but a concentrated burst. The rapid mechanical percussion of automatic weapons, glass exploding inward, and then beneath it, a sound she recognized a half-second later as human screaming. Multiple voices. Below her, the party. Sloane didn't freeze. That surprised her later. When she had time to think about it, she'd always assumed she would freeze in an emergency, had privately believed she was the kind of person who went still under extreme pressure. But her body decided something before her mind got involved, and what her body decided was move. She moved away from the window and toward the stairwell, pulling the emergency door open and descending 2 floors to the mezzanine level, where the string quartet had abandoned their instruments and a woman in red was pressed against the wall with her hands over her ears. The main hall below was chaos: overturned tables, shattered glass, the particular kind of panic movement that happens when 400 people simultaneously try to remember where the exits are. In the center of the marble floor, a man was down. He was older, mid-50s. Sloane guessed wearing the jacket of someone who worked venue security rather than private detail. He was on his back with one hand pressed to his side, and the other reaching for nothing, in particular the way people reach when they're trying to grab hold of something solid and there isn't anything close enough. Sloane crossed the mezzanine at a run, took the main stairs at a pace that nearly lost her footing twice, and dropped to her knees beside him on the floor. Her green dress was already ruined. She pulled the silk scarf from around her neck, a birthday gift from a colleague, $80, good quality, folded it into a compress, and pressed it hard against the wound in his side. Don't move, she said. Look at me. The man looked at her. His eyes were glassy but tracking. You're going to live, she told him, with a certainty she was manufacturing on the spot, because what he needed in that moment was not her uncertainty. You're going to live. So stop trying to do anything and just breathe. She was aware in a distant peripheral way that the gunfire had stopped. She was aware that the remaining guests were still moving toward walls, toward exits, toward each other. She was aware that multiple men in dark clothing had entered the hall from the main doors, moving with the kind of organized efficiency that didn't look like police and didn't look like the attackers either. They moved through the space, sweeping corners, establishing perimeters, communicating in short gestures rather than words. Kept her hands on the man's wound and did not look up. His pulse is steady, said a voice above her. She looked up then. The man standing over her was tall, not in a way that announced itself, but in the way of someone who'd simply grown without trying to occupy space, and had ended up occupying it anyway. Dark suit, no tie, jacket open. His face was hard in the way of someone who'd made a long series of genuinely difficult decisions and had stopped second-guessing the process. He had a small scar through his left eyebrow that looked very old. His eyes were not unkind, but they were not warm either. They were the eyes of someone who noticed things. His pulse is steady, the man repeated, and my team has a medic. You can let go. I'll let go when someone with actual medical training is on top of this, Sloane said. Who are you? There was a brief pause, not offended. Assessing Damon Bellucci. She knew the name. Everybody in this city knew the name. Pressed the compress harder and looked back down at the man on the floor. Get your medic over here. Another pause. Then, Vargas. A younger man appeared at her side, knelt, opened a bag. He was efficient and fast, and when he placed his own hands over hers, she felt him take the pressure before she lifted her palms away. She sat back on her heels and looked down at her hands. The blood on them was already cooling. Damon Bellucci crouched beside her, not kneeling, crouching, like someone who didn't intend to be in that position for long. You didn't run, he said. Neither did you. I had a reason to be here. So did I, she said. And then I didn't. And then that man was on the floor, so I had a new reason. He studied her for a moment, with that same flat, measuring quality in his eyes. Those men came for someone specific at this party. They'll be back. Or they'll have people in the building. If you're connected to Cross Financial in any visible way, you're exposed until we know who they were targeting. Sloane became aware, in a rush, that her name was on the seating chart downstairs, that her face had been in the promotional materials for this event, and that her connection to Evan was publicly documented on 4 different financial news sites. She became aware that Evan was upstairs. She felt the specific absence of any impulse to go warn him. If you want to survive tonight, Damon said, come with me. It was not a romantic offer. It was not charged with anything except the simple transactional clarity of someone who assessed situations accurately and communicated what he found. He wasn't asking her to trust him. He was presenting her with a calculation: stay in an unsecured building in a compromised position, or leave with the one man in the room whose security team had just ended an armed attack with disciplined efficiency. Sloane looked at her hands again. Then she stood up. Okay, she said. She didn't go back upstairs. She didn't send a message. She left the building with Damon Bellucci and 3 members of his security team through a service exit, got into the back of a black vehicle, and sat with her hands in her lap while the city moved past the darkened windows. He sat across from her. He didn't ask her anything for the first 10 minutes. She didn't offer anything. She looked out the window and thought about the ring skittering across the marble floor and the way Evan had been calculating while he sat up, and the way the man on the floor had grabbed for something solid when there was nothing to grab, and the way the medic's hands had taken the pressure from hers with such practiced certainty. You're Sloane Mercer, Damon said finally, communications director, Cross Financial. Former, she said without looking away from the window. Probably former, because of what happened tonight. Because of what happened before tonight. He didn't press it. The vehicle moved through 3 security checkpoints. She counted without commenting on them, and then through a gate, and then into a compound that was larger than she'd expected, not ostentatious, but substantial. Stone. New security. The kind of property that said, I have been here a long time and I intend to remain. A woman met them at the entrance, middle-aged, the posture of someone accustomed to authority within a defined sphere. She looked at Sloane the way people look at unexpected variables, and then she looked at Damon. Arrange a room for Ms. Mercer, Damon said. Something decent. Sir, the woman said, and moved. Sloane followed Damon through a hall that was not decorated to impress anyone, but contained the particular kind of quality that comes from simply buying things that last. Stone floors, good lighting, no art that was trying to prove anything. A house that had been lived in by someone who didn't need the house to do his talking for him. You don't have to tell me anything tonight, Damon said, pausing at the entrance to a sitting room. Get cleaned up. Sleep if you can. We'll talk in the morning. Sloane looked at him. What are we going to talk about? Your options, he said. And mine. Why does what happened tonight affect your options? Damon looked at her steadily. Because the men who hit that party were connected to a situation I've been managing for 6 weeks. And you just watched 4 of them go down and handed my people a witness account that was more precise than anything my own team got in the immediate aftermath. I'm not going to pretend that's not useful. So this is transactional, Sloane said. Everything is, Damon said. The question is whether the terms are fair. She looked at him for a moment. He returned the look without performing anything. No reassurance, no threat, no charm. Just presence. Just that flat, accurate attention. Okay, Sloane said. She followed the woman, who introduced herself only as Perrin, to a room on the 2nd floor that contained a bed, a bathroom, a change of clothes in her approximate size that she didn't ask about, and a window that looked out over a back garden, in which 2 members of Damon's security team were walking the perimeter with the quiet attentiveness of people who did this every night. She stood at that window for a long time after Perrin left. She thought about calling someone. She didn't have anyone obvious to call. Her mother was gone. Mara was Mara. Her friends from before Evan had drifted into the category of people she occasionally saw at events, and genuinely meant to contact more often. Her colleagues at Cross Financial were Evan's colleagues. She had spent 4 years structuring her life around two people who were not structuring anything around her. She realized, standing at that window, that she was not devastated. She was angry. She was exhausted. She was aware of a profound and clarifying kind of loneliness. But she was not devastated, and that told her something true about the last 4 years that she'd been refusing to look at directly. She'd been alone in that relationship for a long time. Night had simply made it official. She changed clothes. She washed her hands very carefully and watched the water run clear. She lay down on the bed without expecting to sleep and fell asleep within 4 minutes because her body was done. In the morning, Damon Bellucci would tell her that he needed to be legally married within 48 hours. He would explain it without apology. A succession clause in the Bellucci Group's charter, a hostile faction within the family, assets that represented decades of legitimate business expansion that would evaporate if he failed to satisfy the clause before the board convened. He would tell her he needed a wife who was not afraid of the name Bellucci, who was intelligent enough to navigate the visibility the arrangement required, and who had sufficient reason to accept an offer with no expectation of permanence. He would tell her the terms: complete financial independence, a protected identity, a contract with a clearly defined exit. Sloane would sit across from him in the morning light of his study and look at her hands, the same hands that had pressed a scarf against a stranger's wound the night before, and she would think about Evan calculating his next move from the bed where her sister was sitting. She would think about 4 years of careful, invisible work that had built someone else's reputation instead of her own. She would think about the ring spinning across the marble floor and not once feeling the urge to pick it up. Then she would look at Damon Bellucci, at the scar through his eyebrow and the unhurried patience of someone who was accustomed to waiting for accurate information before he decided anything. And she would say, "Tell me exactly what you need, and then I'll tell you what I need, and we'll see if the math works." It would. But what neither of them would account for, what no contract ever accounts for, is the particular danger of being truly seen by someone who has spent their entire life making certain nobody gets close enough to try. By the time Sloane understood what was happening between them, it would already be too late to pretend it was just business. And by the time Damon understood it, he would have already made the most irrational decision of his life. He would have started caring whether she was all right. For a man who had built an empire on the principle that attachment was a liability, that single shift would cost him more than any enemy had ever managed to extract. But that was still ahead of them on the other side of a morning that hadn't arrived yet. In a room where a woman who had just lost everything she'd been holding on to lay in the dark and thought, "I'm still here," and meant it as the beginning of something, not the end. She woke up before the light changed. Not gradually, not the slow drift upward through sleep that comes when you've rested properly, but all at once, the way the body wakes when it has processed something enormous overnight and arrived at the morning with its conclusions already drawn. Sloane lay on her back in the unfamiliar bed and stared at the ceiling of a room in Damon Bellucci's compound and thought, "I have nothing to go back to, and I am not going back." It was not a dramatic thought. It arrived the way practical thoughts arrive, flat, clear, with a kind of relief underneath it that surprised her. She sat up. The clothes Perrin had left were plain and well-fitted dark slacks, a gray pullover, flat shoes in exactly her size. She didn't ask herself how they knew. She dressed, went to the window, and watched 2 members of the security team change positions in the garden below with the unhurried precision of people who had done this long enough that it no longer required thought. The morning was gray and cold. Somewhere behind the clouds, the sun was up. She could tell by the quality of the light. She found the bathroom, washed her face, looked at herself in the mirror for longer than she usually did, because she was trying to locate something, some crack, some sign of the collapse she felt like she should be experiencing. Her eyes were clear. Her jaw was set. She looked tired in the way of someone who'd done hard physical labor, not in the way of someone who'd been gutted. She went downstairs. Damon was already in the study, not waiting for her working. There were documents on the desk and a second screen open to something she couldn't read from the doorway, and a cup of coffee near his right hand that looked like it had been there long enough to cool. He looked up when she appeared in the doorframe and didn't perform any kind of welcome. "Sit down," he said. She sat. He closed the secondary screen, picked up his coffee, looked at it, set it back down. "I need to explain something before I explain everything else." "Go ahead." "The Bellucci Group's charter was drafted by my grandfather in 9971, Damon said. Contains a succession clause that was inserted as a condition of a partnership agreement with two other families, both of whom are now positioned to trigger it. Clause requires that any primary holder of the group's controlling interest must be legally married before the age of 46, or transfer 40% of voting shares to the family trust, which at this point is effectively controlled by my cousin Victor and his backers." Sloane listened without interrupting. "I turned 46 in 51 hours, Damon said. There was a silence in which she absorbed this. "And you're telling me this because you're sitting in my house, and you're not an idiot, and I don't have time to approach this any other way." He looked at her directly. "I need a wife, legally. On paper, photographed, publicly documented. The marriage has to be real enough to withstand scrutiny, which means it can't be someone from inside my organization that gets picked apart immediately. It has to be someone with an independent identity, a verifiable background, a reason to be here that doesn't read as manufactured." "And I walked into your building last night," Sloane said. "You walked into my building last night, held a compress on a man's wound without being asked, gave my team a precise account of the attacker's positions and movements, when most witnesses couldn't tell me what color they were wearing. And you clearly have a reason to put some distance between yourself and your previous life." He looked at her steadily. "I'm not pretending this benefits you equally. It doesn't. But I can make the terms fair." Sloane looked at him. "What happened last night? The attack. Was that connected to your succession problem?" A brief pause. "The two situations are related. That's not an answer." "No," Damon said. "It's not." She sat with that for a moment. The morning light, through the study windows, was still gray. Somewhere down the hall she could hear Perrin moving, and the low register of a conversation between two members of the security team, and under all of it, particular silence of a large house that has been kept in order for a long time by people who are very good at their jobs. "Tell me the terms," Sloane said. He told her. The marriage would be registered within 24 hours through a process that was legally clean, but administratively expedited. He didn't explain how, and she didn't ask. She would take his name publicly. She would appear at a minimum of 6 public events in the first 60 days. She would be given a private residence within the compound, complete financial independence, a monthly allowance that he named without blinking, and that made her go still for a moment, because it was more than she'd earned in any single year of her career. She would have access to legal counsel of her own choosing. The arrangement would terminate at a mutually agreed point, at which time she would receive the $5 million settlement that had been prepared as part of the standard contract. When he finished, she said, "I want the legal counsel before I sign anything." "Obviously," Damon said. "And I want it to be someone entirely outside your organization." He looked at her. Something shifted very slightly in his expression, not quite respect, but adjacent to it. "I'll have a list of independent firms prepared by noon. And I want to understand the public role," Sloane said. "What am I supposed to be? What's the story?" "We met 4 months ago through a mutual connect in the legitimate business sector," Damon said. "We kept it private. The timing of the marriage is fast but not inexplicable. I'm a private person. You've just come through a difficult personal situation, and neither of us is the type to perform a long engagement for an audience." "That's actually plausible," Sloane said. "I know," Damon said. "I didn't build what I've built by constructing stories that fall apart under pressure." She looked at the desk, at the documents she couldn't read from where she was sitting, cooled coffee, at the scar through his left eyebrow. "I'll talk to the lawyers," she said. "If the contract says what you've told me it says, I'll sign it." "That's all I'm asking," Damon said. "No," Sloane said. "You're asking considerably more than that. But I understand what I'm getting in exchange." She stood up. "I'll need to go back to my apartment at some point to get my things. Send a list to Perrin. She'll arrange it. I'll go myself," Sloane said. He looked at her. I'm not a variable you're managing, she said. I'm a person you're entering into a legal contract with. Establish that distinction now, and we'll have fewer problems later. The silence stretched for 4 seconds, maybe 5. Vargas will drive you, Damon said. You'll have 2 security personnel with you at all times until we've established what happened last night. Fine, Sloane said. That's reasonable. She left the study and went back upstairs to get nothing. Because there was nothing to get, and stood in the hallway for a moment and with her eyes closed, and her hand flat against the wall, and thought, you are doing this. You are actually doing this. Then she straightened up and went to find Perrin to arrange the lawyers. Contract was presented to her at 2 in the afternoon by a firm she verified independently before the meeting, in a conference room in the east wing of the compound that was neutral enough to feel almost normal. She read every word. She asked 11 questions. 3 of them caught the senior partner slightly off guard, which told her the partner had expected her to skim, and the fact that she hadn't recalibrated something in the room. She signed at 4:47. The marriage registration happened at 7 the following morning in a municipal office that Damon's legal team had arranged to be open early. The official was professional and brisk. There were no flowers, no music, no performance of anything. Damon signed. Sloane signed. The documents were filed, and it was done. She was Mrs. Bellucci before breakfast. She stood outside the municipal building in the early cold and breathed, and thought, Evan is waking up right now somewhere in that penthouse, and he does not know yet. She was surprised to find that this gave her almost nothing. Not satisfaction, not grief. A mild clinical interest, like watching a weather pattern change from a distance. Vargas brought the car around. She got in. The announcement went out through Damon's public relations contact. At 9 that morning, a brief statement, a photograph taken 40 minutes earlier on the steps of the compound, both of them in dark clothing, her hand in his arm, his expression composed, hers steady, no excessive detail, no performance of joy, just the clean, visible fact of 2 people who had decided on something. By 9:40, Sloane's phone, a new one Perrin had arranged, was logging notifications she didn't open. By 10, Victor Bellucci had called Damon twice. She knew this because she was in the corridor outside the study when the second call came in, and she heard Damon's voice change, not dramatically, not in a way most people would catch, but she caught it. Particular compression that happens in a voice when the speaker is controlling something significant and doing it in real time. She kept moving. She went to the room that had been arranged as her office. She'd asked for a working space immediately, on the grounds that sitting idle in a strange house while other people managed. Her situation was not something she was going to do, and she opened her laptop and began working. She started with what she knew. The Bellucci Group's public profile was extensive but unevenly managed, strong in the legitimate business sector, patchy in the areas where media scrutiny had applied pressure, conspicuously silent on several community and governance issues where silence read as an answer. She mapped it in the way she always mapped organizational communication problems, not starting from what they wanted to say, but starting from what the audience already believed, and then identifying every point where belief and reality diverged. She was an hour into this when Perrin knocked. Victor Bellucci is requesting a meeting, Perrin said. He's asking to come here. Sloane didn't look up from her screen. What did Damon say? He hasn't responded yet. Sloane looked up. Tell him I said no. Perrin's expression shifted in a way that told Sloane she had either said the right thing or crossed a line she'd discover later. You're responding on his behalf. I'm responding on mine, Sloane said. Victor is requesting a meeting at a location I'm currently occupying. That makes it my decision as much as Damon's. Tell him no. If he has legitimate business to conduct with the Bellucci Group, he can arrange it through proper channels. Perrin looked at her for a moment. Then she nodded and left. Sloane went back to the screen. Damon appeared in her doorway 9 minutes later. You told Victor no, he said. I told him not today. That's not your. He was testing response time, Sloane said. He wanted to see how long it took you to respond to pressure, and whether the response would be controlled or reactive. Immediate and controlled is better than delayed and considered. Communications principle, not opinion. She looked at Damon. If I'm doing this, I'm doing it. If you want someone who sits quietly in a room while the organization handles itself, I'm the wrong choice. Damon stood in the doorway. His jaw had tightened in the small, contained way she was starting to recognize, not anger, exactly. More like the sensations of encountering something that hadn't been in his calculations and having to revise them in real time. Victor isn't someone you manage, he said. He's someone you're careful around. I know the difference, Sloane said. I'm being careful. Careful isn't the same as deferential. He looked at her screen. At the map she'd built of the group's communication profile, the notes she'd made in the margins. He looked at it for a moment, longer than she expected. Then he walked in, moved around the desk, and looked at the screen properly. She watched him read. He read fast, and he read accurately, she could tell, by the way his eyes moved, the places they slowed down. He reached the section she'd marked in red and stopped. This is the harbor development coverage, he said. Where your public trust problem is most acute, Sloane said. 3 outlets, all running the same frame. Someone is feeding them. It's not organic. Damon straightened up. His face was doing something she couldn't fully read. You put this together this morning. I had 4 hours. Who authorized your access to the group's media archive? No one, Sloane said. It's public coverage. I used what's publicly available. He looked at her. A long, flat look that she returned without adjusting anything. The harbor development, he said finally. What's your assessment? Your response strategy was defensive, she said. Defensive postures in public communication. Tell the audience you have something to hide, even when you don't. You needed to be 48 hours ahead of the narrative, not scrambling after it. Whoever is advising your communications team is either not good enough for this environment or is specifically steering you wrong. She paused. Which is it? Damon said nothing for a moment. What makes you think it's one or the other? Because incompetence and sabotage look almost identical from the outside, Sloane said. The difference is in the pattern. Incompetence makes random mistakes. Sabotage makes mistakes that consistently benefit the same party. She tapped the screen. These mistakes consistently benefit Victor's faction, which means your communications team has a problem.
I shall know.
Damon's expression had gone very still, not cold, something more interior than that. How long have you been doing this? Building communication profiles? 11 years. No, he said, seeing the difference between incompetence and sabotage. She looked at him. Since I was 22, and my first employer had a CFO who was systematically misreporting quarterly figures in ways that always somehow landed them a better bonus structure. Damon looked at her for a moment. Then he picked up the chair across the desk, turned it, and sat down. Tell me what you do about the harbor situation, he said. She told him. He listened the way she'd noticed. He listened completely, without interrupting, without performing attention, but actually paying it. When she finished, he asked 3 questions, all of them precise, all of them aimed at the weakest parts of her proposal, which told her he'd understood everything she'd said and gone straight to the problems. She answered the questions. He nodded once, slowly, and then was quiet for a moment. I'll arrange a meeting with the communications team, he said. Tomorrow morning today, Sloane said. They need today, she repeated. Victor is already moving. If he's feeding coverage on the harbor situation, the next piece lands before the week is out. We need to be positioned before it does. Damon looked at her. You've been in this house for 16 hours. I know, Sloane said. Is that a problem? A pause. No, he said today. He left. She turned back to the screen and kept working. The communications team met with her at 3 that afternoon in a conference room that went very quiet when she walked in. There were 6 of them, 4 men, 2 women, ranging in age from late 20s to early 50s. The eldest, a man named Calloway, who had the specific kind of ease that comes from long institutional comfort, looked at Sloane with the polite, evaluating blankness of someone who was waiting to be unimpressed. Sloane stood at the front of the room and didn't set up a presentation. She picked up a marker and wrote 3 words on the whiteboard. Petin, source, response. I'm going to show you what your last 18 months of coverage looks like from outside the building, she said. I'm going to show you the pattern. Then I'm going to ask you to identify the source. And then we're going to talk about whether your current response strategy or a set of habits that got organized into a document Calloway said. With respect, Mrs. Bellucci, we've been managing the group's public profile for. I know how long you've been doing it, Sloane said. I've read your output. That's what we're discussing. She looked at him steadily. I'm not here to tell you you're bad at your jobs. I'm here to tell you the jobs have changed and the playbook hasn't caught up. Those are different problems with different solutions. I'd like to work on the solutions if you're willing. Calloway was quiet. If you're not willing, Sloane said, that's information I need to have too. He looked at her for a moment, looked at the whiteboard. Then he nodded, very slightly, and picked up his pen. She worked with them for 2 hours. By the end of the first hour, she'd found the 2 members of the team who were actually good, a woman named Petra, who asked questions that cut straight to the structural problem, and a younger man named Davis, who had the particular gift of translating complex organizational narrative into plain language without losing accuracy. By the end of the second hour, she had a preliminary response framework for the harbor situation that was 48 hours ahead of where they'd been that morning. She also had a clear read on Calloway. He wasn't sabotaging anything. He was simply comfortable in ways that had curdled into complacency, a different problem. Manageable if he could be persuaded to move. She wasn't sure yet whether he could. She left the conference room at 5 and found Victor Bellucci waiting in the main hall. She knew him immediately from the photographs she'd found during the morning's research. Taller than Damon by an inch, with the similar bone structure of shared blood and the kind of surface pleasantness that is specifically designed to function as camouflage. He smiled when he saw her. The smile was excellent. You must be Sloane, he said, and held out his hand. She shook it. His grip was calibrated firm but not aggressive, held for 1 second longer than necessary. A test. She matched his pressure and released it cleanly. Victor, she said, I thought you weren't coming today. I was in the neighborhood, he said pleasantly. I hope you don't mind. Perrin let me in. She would deal with Perrin later. Damon is occupied, Sloane said. Is there something I can help you with? Victor's smile stayed in place, with the practiced ease of someone who'd trained it. I just wanted to say hello to the new Mrs. Bellucci, he said. The announcement was quite the surprise. I imagine it was, Sloane said. Damon has always kept his personal life very private, Victor said. He was doing something with his eyes, not quite searching, more like mapping, looking for the seams in her composure. It's good that he's found someone. Family is important. It is, Sloane agreed. Of course, the timing is. He paused. The pause performed with great care. Interesting. Given the board meeting. Given the charter clause, Sloane said. Victor looked at her. Something flickered behind the smile, brief and unreadable. You know about that. I'm his wife, Sloane said. Not a houseplant. The smile stayed. But something behind it had recalibrated. Of course, he said. Well, I hope we'll have a chance to get to know each other properly. You're clearly a remarkable woman. Thank you, Sloane said. I'll let Damon know you stopped by. She held his gaze until he looked away first. He did it casually, turning to admire something on the wall, the pivot smooth enough that most people wouldn't have clocked it as a retreat, but it was a retreat. Victor Bellucci left 4 minutes later. Damon found her in the hall shortly after. He came anyway. Yes, Sloane said. What did he say? He said family is important, and I'm a remarkable woman. She looked at Damon. He was mapping me, checking the seams. And I don't have any, she said. Visible ones. Anyway. She paused. He's more dangerous than the way you've been treating him. Damon's expression shifted. Meaning, whoever is advising you is letting you underestimate him, because underestimating him is comfortable, Sloane said. He's not a nuisance. He's been building towards something for a long time, and the harbor coverage and the attack the other night are probably connected in ways that go further back than 6 weeks. Damon was very still. Why do you say that? Because men like Victor don't improvise, Sloane said. They construct. Everything he does is a layer of something larger, and the thing he came here today for wasn't to meet me. She looked at the hall, the direction Victor had gone. He came to see whether I was real. And I was real, she said. Damon looked at her for a long moment. Something in his expression had shifted from the evaluating quality she'd come to read, as his default, into something slightly less managed, slightly more interior. Dinner is at 7, he said finally. with 2 board members who want to assess the situation. I'll be there, Sloane said. You don't have to. Damon, she said. I'll be there. The dinner was formal in the way of events, where the formality is a test rather than a convention. The board members, a man named Hargrove and a woman named Castellan, arrived at 7 sharp, which told Sloane they were punctual people who expected punctuality to be noticed. She was in the dining room already, standing at the window, when they were brought in by Perrin. She turned and greeted them by name before introductions were made. Castellan's eyes sharpened. You've done your research. I make a habit of it, Sloane said. The dinner lasted 2 hours. Sloane ate sparingly and listened comprehensively, and spoke only when she had something specific to add, which had turned out to be more frequently than either board member had expected. By the end of the first course, Hargrove had abandoned the particular brand of practiced condescension he'd arrived with. By the end of the second, Castellan was asking Sloane direct questions rather than angling them through Damon, which was a significant shift that Damon noticed without commenting on. Sloane noticed him notice. After the board members left, Damon walked to the window with a glass of something dark and looked out at the garden. Castellan will vote to confirm, he said. I wasn't certain of that before tonight. Hargrove needs one more meeting, Sloane said. He's persuadable. He just needs to feel like the decision is his. Damon turned and looked at her. The light in the dining room was low and the house was quiet around them. You were doing that the entire dinner, he said, framing things so he arrived at conclusions on his own. That's what good communication is, Sloane said. You don't tell people what to think. You arrange the information so they think it themselves. You're very good at it, Damon said, and it wasn't flattery. It was the same direct factual quality he applied to everything he said. I know, Sloane said. There was a silence that was different from the silences they'd been having all day, less transactional, less organized around the immediate problem. She became aware of it and didn't particularly try to end it. Then Perrin appeared in the doorway. Sir, you need to see this. The tone of Perrin's voice changed every temperature in the room. They moved to the study. The secondary screen was running 3 parallel feeds from different outlets, all of them carrying the same story. The headline, in 3 different typefaces, said essentially the same thing. Bellucci marriage, a fraud contract exposed. Someone had leaked the contract, not the full document enough. Enough to show that the marriage had been agreed before the ceremony, that financial terms had been negotiated, that the timing aligned precisely with the charter clause deadline. The framing in all 3 outlets was identical. In its essence, Sloane Mercer had sold herself to the most dangerous man in the city for $5 million and the protection of his name. Sloane stood in front of the screens and read every word of every piece. She read the comment sections. She read the reposts. She read the 3 social accounts that were already running the story with added embellishment, including one that had found and circulated a photograph of her from the Cross Financial website with a caption she was going to set aside and not think about for the moment. The room was very quiet. Damon was watching her read. She could feel it. She finished, took a breath, let it out slowly through her nose. Who had access to the contract? She said. The legal team, Damon said. His voice had gone flat and dangerous. Perrin, 3 members of my inner circle. Who knew about the charter clause deadline? Victor's faction, the board. Anyone who'd read the charter carefully in the last 6 months. Was the contract itself stored digitally, encrypted, on a closed system? Someone gave Victor the access or the document directly, Sloane said. Either there's a breach in your inner circle or someone on the legal team was approached and accepted. She looked at him. This isn't a media problem. It's an internal security problem. The media is a symptom. Damon's expression was doing the thing it did when he was moving through something at speed behind an exterior that showed very little. I know, he said. Then we handle both simultaneously, Sloane said. Do it before morning. The story is already out, Damon said. The story is out, Sloane agreed. Which means we have approximately 6 hours before the cycle accelerates into the morning editions. 6 hours is enough time to change the frame if we move immediately and if we decide right now that defense is the wrong posture. What's the right posture, Damon said. Offense, Sloane said, but not the kind people expect. She looked at the screen. at her own face on the Cross Financial website, at the comment sections, filling with the specific kind of language that people use when they want to degrade a woman, without appearing to degrade a woman. I released the contract myself. The silence in the room was complete. Full contract, she continued. Unedited. Tonight. With a statement from me, not from your communications team, from me that says, yes, this is a contract marriage. Yes, it was a business arrangement. And here is every term, in full, so that anyone who has an opinion about the terms can form that opinion from the actual document rather than a selective leak designed to damage both of us. She looked at Damon, because the only thing more damaging than people knowing the truth is people knowing that we tried to hide the truth. Damon stared at her. You're talking about handing every critic exactly what they're looking for. I'm talking about removing the weapon from Victor's hand by making it useless, she said. A secret has power only until it's public. Once it's public, it's just information. Information can be framed. Secrets can't frame themselves the moment they leak. Damon was completely still for a moment that stretched long enough that she heard the security team shift positions outside and the faint movement of wind against the windows. If we do this, he said slowly, there's no pulling it back. There's already no pulling it back, Sloane said. Victor made sure of that tonight. The only question is whether we respond to his version or replace it with ours. Damon looked at the screen, at the headlines, at the photograph of Sloane with the caption beneath it. She watched something cross his face that was brief and very human, a flash of something that wasn't calculation, that looked more like the particular fury of someone who has just watched another person be hurt by something he was adjacent to. It was there for less than 2 seconds. Then it was managed and gone. Do it, he said. Sloane reached for her phone. She drafted the statement herself, standing at the desk in the study, while Damon stood at the window, and Perrin coordinated with the communications team, and 2 members of the legal team were pulled from their evening on short notice. The draft took 11 minutes. She read it back once, changed 4 words, and sent it to Petra, the one person on the communications team she'd identified that afternoon as genuinely competent, with instructions to release it through every verified channel simultaneously. Petra responded in 3 minutes, ready. Sloane looked at Damon. Ready. He looked at her across the room. You understand what this costs you. I understand what hiding it would cost me, she said. That's a higher price. She sent the confirmation. The statement landed at 11:47. By midnight, it was the top result on every search for both of their names. By 12:30, the framing had already begun to shift, not unanimously, not without resistance, but the counter-narrative was established, and it was hers. Not Damon's, not the Bellucci group's, hers. She sat in the study long after everyone else had gone to their respective tasks, reading the responses, tracking the shift in real time. Damon came back at 1 a.m. with 2 cups of coffee and set one beside her without comment. She didn't thank him. She picked it up and drank it and kept reading. They sat in silence for 20 minutes, while the story developed around them, while somewhere across the city, Victor Bellucci was reading the same feeds and understanding that his leak had been converted into something he hadn't prepared for, and that the woman he'd calculated would run or collapse was still at a desk at 1 a.m, awake and working, and entirely, dangerously unbroken. And then Damon said, quietly, almost not a question, "Who taught you to fight like this?" Sloane looked up. She thought about it for a moment. "Nobody," she said. "I figured it out myself." She went back to the screen. Outside, the city was doing what it always did, moving, adjusting, absorbing each new thing that happened and incorporating it and moving on. And somewhere in that city, Evan Cross was watching the same feeds, reading the same headlines, and beginning to understand that the woman he dismissed as a fixture in his carefully arranged life had walked into something that was going to make her completely unreachable. And somewhere else, a man named Roman Greco, a name that had appeared twice in the financial trail. Sloane had begun pulling on that morning and had noted and set aside, for later was reading the same headlines and making a very different kind of calculation. Not about Damon, about her. Because Roman Greco understood, with the specific clarity of someone who had spent 2 decades identifying the one thing in any situation that had the most potential to destabilize everything around it. Sloane Mercer Bellucci was not a liability that Damon had acquired. She was the single most dangerous variable anyone had introduced into the city's power structure in years. And the most effective way to destroy Damon Bellucci was not to attack the Empire. It was to go after the one thing Damon had not, until 11:47 that evening, given anyone reason to believe he might actually need. Roman Greco moved the way. Expensive problems move quietly, with good timing, and always through someone else's hands. Sloane didn't know his name properly until the fourth day after the contract release. She'd seen it twice in the financial trail. She'd been building a shell company registered in Delaware, a secondary holding in the Harbor Development's opposition funding, but she'd flagged it and moved on because there were larger fires burning and she'd been triaging. That was the mistake she'd make sense of later, when she had the distance to see it clearly. Treated Roman Greco as a footnote when he was already reading her as the headline. The fourth morning in the compound started the way the previous three had started. She was up before the light changed, her desk, before Perrin had finished her first pass through the building, and 2 coffees in before most of the staff reached the kitchen. She'd established this rhythm, not as performance, but because her brain worked best in the early hours, when the house was quiet and the noise from outside hadn't yet accumulated enough volume to push into her thinking. She was reviewing the forensic audit she'd quietly commissioned using her own counsel, her own funding. The settlement advance she'd negotiated into the contract as an accessible line rather than a deferred payment. When Petra sent her a message at 6:42 that said only "you need to see this before it goes wide," attached was a pre-publication link. Sloane clicked it. Piece was long 4,200 words, and it was not from one of the outlets Victor had been feeding. It was from a financial investigative publication that had a serious reputation and a history of breaking stories that held up under scrutiny. The byline was a journalist named Audra Fenn, who Sloane knew by reputation as someone who did not publish until she was certain. The headline read, "The Bellucci Group's Shadow Ledger, How a Legitimate Empire Was Built on 20 Years of Laundered Capital." Sloane read the entire piece without moving. She read it the way she read everything that mattered, not skimming for the thesis, but tracking the structure, the sourcing, the specific language that tells you whether a journalist is working from solid documentation or inference dressed as fact. Audra Fenn was working from documentation. Piece cited internal financial records, wire transfer histories, shell company registrations across 4 jurisdictions, and 2 named sources described as former senior employees of the Bellucci Group's financial division. It was not wrong exactly. It was worse than wrong. It was selectively, surgically accurate about specific transactions that Sloane had no knowledge of, framed in a way that implied a totality of corruption that those specific transactions may or may not have actually represented. She couldn't tell from the inside. She didn't have access to the information that would let her verify or contest it. That was the specific design of what she was reading. Printed the piece. She made herself a 3rd coffee. She sat with the printed pages and a pen and went through every claim, every citation, every number, and marked the ones that were verifiable from public sources, the ones that required internal access to verify, and the ones that she flatly did not know enough to assess. By the time she finished, the margins of the pages were dense with her handwriting, and the coffee had cooled untouched. Then she went to find Damon. He was already awake. She'd established that he slept less than most people and never appeared particularly diminished by it. And when she walked into the study with the printed pages and set them on his desk without preamble, he looked at her face before he looked at the pages. "How bad?" he said. "Read it," she said. He read. He read faster than she had the particular reading speed of someone accustomed to processing large quantities of dense information under time pressure. He didn't react visibly while he read, which told her either that none of this was new to him or that he'd developed a level of composure that made reaction indistinguishable from its absence. When he finished, he set the pages down. "Well," Sloane said. "Some of this is accurate," Damon said. The directness of that, the absence of deflection, caught her slightly off guard. She'd been prepared for denial, or for the particular maneuvering language of someone who is technically not lying, but is constructing something carefully. She hadn't been prepared for this. Some, she said. The transactions they've cited, 3 of them, are real. The framing around them is not accurate, but the transactions exist.
He looked at her steadily.
The Bellucci Group inherited a financial structure from my grandfather's era that was not clean. I have spent 11 years systematically separating the legitimate operation from the institution. It is not a finished process. Sloane looked at him. How many people know the full scope of that inherited structure? My CFO, my senior legal counsel, 2 members of the original board who were present during the transition period. He paused. Victor, she absorbed this. Victor has documentation. Victor has access to documentation that he was given as part of his position in the family trust. Access he retained when I restructured his role 18 months ago and reduced his direct involvement in financial operations. Damon's jaw tightened. I should have revoked it then. I didn't, because revoking it would have triggered a legal challenge that I wasn't positioned to fight at that time. So he's had 18 months to build this package, Sloane said. At minimum. She sat down. Not heavily, she lowered herself into the chair with the particular precision of someone who is managing a physical response to information and needs the movement to be controlled. Piece publishes in, she checked her phone, 3 hours and 40 minutes. Petra found the pre-publication link through a monitoring alert we set up 2 days ago. We have a window. To do what? Damon said. The documentation they're citing is real. Can't contest real documentation. You can context it, Sloane said. You can get ahead of the frame before the frame sets. 3 hours is enough time to put your own statement out through verified channels. One that acknowledges the historical structure, establishes the timeline of the remediation work you've done, and positions the piece as a selective cut of a larger, more complex truth. She looked at him. It won't stop the damage, but it changes the ratio between their narrative and yours. And if the remediation isn't complete enough, Damon said, if what they have is more extensive than 3 transactions, then we find that out today. Sloane said, instead of tomorrow, and we deal with it from a position where we're already on record about the history rather than appearing to respond to exposure. Damon looked at her. There was something in his face she hadn't seen before, not vulnerability exactly. The kind of held tension that lives in a person who has been managing something alone for a very long time and is experiencing the specific strangeness of not managing it alone anymore. There's something else, he said. The temperature in the room changed. The 2 sources Fen cites, he said. Former senior employees of the financial division. I know who they are. Both of them left the organization within the last 8 months. Both of them were given clean exit severance, references, no legal action, despite the fact that one of them had specific knowledge of proprietary processes that he took with him. Damon's voice had gone flat and precise. I gave them clean exits because I was advised to. By my senior legal counsel. Sloane went very still. By Harland, Damon said. Marcus Harland, who has been my legal counsel for 9 years. Who I brought into the inner circle 3 years into my tenure. Who has more access to the Bellucci Group's genuine operational picture than any single person outside myself. He picked up the printed pages. Who appears nowhere in this piece. Sloane heard what he wasn't saying. She heard the architecture of it, the way an absence can be more telling than a presence. The way someone who should be visible in a story about information he had exclusive access to, and instead isn't there at all, is making a very specific choice. Where is Harland right now, she said. I don't know, Damon said. He was supposed to be in a meeting with Victor's legal team at 9 this morning, a scheduled negotiation I've been using to track Victor's movements. Called it off last night. Said he was unwell. Sloane stood up. Call him. Damon picked up his phone and called. The call went to voicemail. He called a second number, an office line, and got an assistant who told him Mr. Harland had not come in and had not sent word. Sloane said, he's gone. The words landed in the room like something physical. Damon set his phone down. The stillness in him was different now, not composed. Exactly. More like someone who has absorbed a blow from an unexpected direction and is processing the recalibration required. She watched it happen across his face in the space of maybe 3 seconds, and then she watched it disappear behind the competence he defaulted to under pressure. Get your counsel on the phone, he said. I need to know what Harland had access to in the last 72 hours. Already dialing, Sloane said, and she was. The next 2 hours were the most operationally compressed of her life, and she'd had some compressed ones. Her counsel, a woman named Ree, who billed by the 6-minute increment and moved at a speed that justified every dollar of it, established within 40 minutes that Marcus Harland had accessed the Bellucci Group's secure document system at 11:15 the previous evening, downloaded a file package of significant size, and logged out. The system had flagged the access as unusual in volume, but not in credential. The alert had gone to a monitoring team member who had been at the event and had not checked his queue until morning. The file package contained the full remediation timeline, the complete record of what the inherited structure had contained, what had been resolved, what was still outstanding, and the legal strategy Harland had been constructing around the outstanding elements for the past 3 years. It also contained the original Bellucci Group charter succession clause documentation and the legal analysis Harland had prepared of every possible challenge Victor could mount. Roman Greco had the entire map. Sloane sat with this for approximately 90 seconds, which was the amount of time she allowed herself before she made herself think forward rather than backward. Backward was Harland in the system at 11:15, while she and Damon had been sitting in the study with cooling coffee and the contract story shifting in the feeds. Backward was 9 years of trust handed to a man who had been constructing the exit route for someone else the entire time. Backward was useless. Forward was, the piece publishes in 90 minutes. The remediation timeline is now in Roman Greco's possession. Victor has the succession documentation and legal analysis. Harland is gone and will not be recoverable in any useful time frame. Forward was, what do you do with 90 minutes, Damon? She said. He was on his own call across the room. Security, she gathered, coordinating an effort to locate Harland that she privately assessed had a very low probability of useful outcome. He looked at her. I need everything you have on the remediation, she said. All of it. What's complete, what isn't, what the actual gap looks like. Not the legal version, the real version. Sloane, I'm not going to the press with it, she said. I'm building the true frame before the false one sets. If I know the actual shape of the gap, I know exactly how much of what Fenn is publishing is accurate, and how much is constructed around accurate elements to imply something larger. That distinction is the only lever we have. Damon ended his call. He came to the desk and sat down across from her. And then, for the next 40 minutes, he told her everything. She listened without interrupting. She asked 3 questions, all of them factual. Took no notes. She didn't want anything written that wasn't controlled, and she held the information the way she held everything that mattered, in the place where her mind was quietest and most accurate. When he finished, she understood several things simultaneously. That the actual gap in the Bellucci Group's remediation was smaller than Fenn's piece, implied but not negligible. That the 3 transactions cited were the least consequential part of a larger historical structure that had been systematically cleaned over 11 years of painstaking legal work, and that the story being constructed around those 3 transactions was designed not to expose the truth, but to make the truth indistinguishable from a fabrication. It was elegant. She could see Roman Greco's intelligence in the architecture of it, the way it selected real elements, and arranged them into a shape that pointed in a false direction. A journalist as reputable as Audra Fenn would publish it because the elements were real. The damage would land because the conclusions felt earned, and the actual complexity of the truth would be lost in the noise of the simplified version. She wrote the statement herself. 47 minutes, 2 drafts. No help except Damon confirming 3 specific dates she needed to be precisely accurate. She wrote it in the plain, direct language she'd used her whole career, not defensive, not performing contrition, not aggressive, factual, specific, and framed around the timeline of remediation rather than the snapshot of its incompleteness. She sent it to Petra with 8 minutes to spare. The piece published at 10:14. Their statement landed simultaneously through every verified channel at 10:14 and 30 seconds. For 6 hours, both narratives ran in parallel, fighting for the same space in the coverage, and Sloane tracked every development with the focus of someone playing a game, where the pieces were moving faster than she could think, and she was winning anyway, through the specific advantage of knowing exactly what she trying to say while her opponents were reacting. By 4 in the afternoon, the ratio had shifted. Not in their favor, not yet. Not cleanly, but shifted enough that the dominant frame was no longer Fenn's piece alone. The remediation timeline, stated plainly, was harder to dismiss than the implication of concealment. Several financial journalists, who'd originally been running with Fenn's angle, started asking more complicated questions. Complicated questions were slower. Slower was better. Sloane left her desk at 4:30 for the first time since 6 that morning. She went to the kitchen. She stood at the counter and drank a glass of water, and felt the specific variety of exhaustion that comes not from doing too much, but from maintaining precision under sustained pressure. Damon came in. He looked at her and didn't say anything for a moment. The board called, he said finally. 3 of the 5. They want a meeting tomorrow. I know, Sloane said. Castellan reached out to me directly an hour ago. She wants a preliminary call tonight. She called you, Damon said. I've been the visible one, Sloane said. The statement is in my name as much as the group's. That was a choice I made deliberately. It means the board sees me as the point of contact for communication strategy. Castellan doesn't consult with people she doesn't respect, Damon said. I know, Sloane said again. She set down the glass. I'll take the call. You should be on it. If Castellan asked for you, she asked for access to the strategy, Sloane said. The strategy is ours. You should be on the call. Damon looked at her. His expression had the particular quality of someone revising an assumption they'd been operating from without realizing it was an assumption. You could have taken that as a resource, he said. Her respect. Kept it separate from mine. I'm not building a separate position inside your organization, Sloane said. That's not what I'm doing here. I wouldn't blame you if you were, Damon said. Given the terms, she looked at him. The terms as a contract. What I'm doing is the job I agreed to do. Those are different things. He said nothing, but something in his face moved. The call with Castellan was at 7. Sloane ran it cleanly, with Damon present and by the end of it, Castellan had shifted from cautious to committed in a way that would matter significantly at the board meeting. After the call, Damon sat with his phone in his hand for a moment, not using it, and Sloane thought she understood something about the specific loneliness of a man who had been managing this alone for so long that being not alone felt foreign in a way he hadn't anticipated. She didn't say this. She went back to work. The next morning arrived carrying Roman Greco. Not literally, not yet. But he made himself known. At 8:17, Sloane's counsel called with a voice that was professionally flat in the way of someone delivering news they know lands hard. Roman Greco's legal team had filed a formal complaint with the city's Commerce Authority alleging that the Bellucci Group's remediation timeline, as published in Sloane's statement, contained specific misrepresentations. Filing was meticulous. Sloane obtained a copy within the hour and read it with the pen she kept for these purposes, making the same kind of marked-up document she'd made with Fenn's piece 2 days earlier. The filing cited 8 specific claims from her statement and, for each one, provided a counter-document source materials she recognized from their formatting that could only have come from Harlan's downloaded package. Roman had used Harlan's file against her own statement. She'd laid out the frame. He'd identified the points where her frame was most vulnerable and filed a formal challenge against exactly those points. Sloane sat with this for a long time. Not paralyzed, her mind was working, but sitting with it, because what she was looking at required a different kind of response than anything she'd deployed in the past 72 hours. And getting the different kind of response wrong would be worse than no response at all. She went to find Damon. He was in the secure communications room off the east corridor, a room she'd been given access to 48 hours ago as part of the operational integration that had happened more rapidly and more organically than either of them had planned for. He was with 2 of his senior security people, and they were looking at something on a screen that changed when she entered, which she clocked and filed and didn't react to. Roman filed a formal challenge, she said, through the Commerce Authority. using Harlan's materials against our statement. Damon turned fully from the screen. When? 8:17 this morning. Ree has the filing. What's he challenging? 8 specific claims. The ones most dependent on internal documentation to verify. She looked at him, which means he knows exactly what we can and cannot prove from our current evidentiary position. One of the security men, Reyes, the one who'd been with Damon longer and spoke least, said, he's had someone inside longer than Harlan. Sloane looked at him. Explain. Reyes said, Harlan accessed the system 2 nights ago. The filing this morning references internal meetings from 6 months ago. Harlan wasn't at those meetings. Someone else was. The room went very quiet. Sloane thought back through the past 4 days with a new filter. Every meeting she'd attended. Every person in those meetings. Every document that had been in the room. Communications team meeting, she said. Day 1. Who was in that room? Damon said the names. 6 people. She ran them against what she knew. She stopped at 1. Calloway, she said. She said it the way you say something when you've said it before and didn't know you were saying it when the evidence was already there and you'd been looking at it as a management problem, rather than as what it actually was. Calloway has been on the communications team for how long? She said. 7 years, Perrin said from the doorway. She'd appeared silently, the way she always did. Who brought him in? Perrin looked at Damon. Damon's expression had gone very still again. He came highly recommended, Perrin said, through a third-party placement. What third party? Sloane said. The name Perrin gave was a firm whose registration Sloane checked on her phone in approximately 45 seconds and whose corporate filing listed a registered agent that linked, through 2 layers, to a holding company in Victor Bellucci's private portfolio. Calloway had been Victor's placement 7 years ago, before Damon had restructured Victor's role, before the remediation process had reached its current stage. Before any of this, Victor had been positioning Calloway, and through Calloway, Roman Greco, inside the communications infrastructure of the Bellucci Group for 7 years. The thing she diagnosed as complacency was something more specific and more deliberate. Calloway hadn't been failing to evolve the communication strategy. He'd been maintaining a strategy that kept the organization reactive and exposed and dependent on a framework that served Victor's long game. Every defensive posture, every missed window, every response that arrived 48 hours too late to shape the frame. 7 years of it, designed to look like institutional inertia and functioning instead as precise, sustained sabotage. Sloane stood in the room and held this information and felt, for the first time since the penthouse, something that was genuinely close to the sensation of the floor disappearing. Because if Calloway had been in place for 7 years, then the problem wasn't the harbor coverage. It wasn't the Fen piece. It wasn't the formal challenge. Those were all effects. The cause was structural, embedded, and she had sat across from Calloway in that conference room on day 1 and identified him as complacent and moved on. She had been right that he was manageable. She had been wrong about what he was managing. Where is Calloway now? Damon said. His voice was the lowest she'd heard it. Perrin said he came in at 9. He's in his office. Sloane said, don't move him. Damon looked at her. If he knows we know, he's gone before we can use him, she said. Right now he's an asset. He still has access. He has relationships with every outlet. Victor has been feeding. He has lines of communication that we can use. You want to run him, Damon said. I want to feed him one piece of specific, controlled information and watch where it lands, Sloane said. If it goes to Roman's people within 48 hours, we know the pipeline is still active. If it doesn't, we know he's been tipped off, and we're already past that window. She looked at Damon. Either way, we gain information. Right now, information is the only resource we have that Roman doesn't already own a share of. Damon was quiet for a moment. Then he said to Reyes, get everything you can on Calloway's communications in the past 6 months without touching his active channels. Reyes moved. Damon looked at Sloane. What's the piece of information? Something that Roman would want badly enough to act on quickly, she said. Something that implies vulnerability on our side without actually creating it, she thought. The board meeting tomorrow. If Roman believes we're not as confident about the board outcome as we're presenting, he'll try to move on it. If we give Calloway a reason to think we have a soft vote, Hargrove, Damon said. Hargrove, Sloane confirmed. He's the most plausibly uncertain. If we let slip very carefully, through the right channel, that Hargrove's support is conditional on something Roman could theoretically disrupt. Roman will try to reach Hargrove directly, Damon said. And when he does, Hargrove tells us, Sloane said, because Hargrove has no relationship with Roman and no reason to help him. But it gives us a confirmed line of communication between Calloway and Roman's operation, which is the evidentiary piece we're missing. Damon stood very still for a moment. You want to use Hargrove as bait. I want to ask Hargrove to participate in something that requires him to do nothing, except report a contact if it happens, she said. He's a board member. He's not going to be in physical danger from a conversation. Roman doesn't always limit himself to conversations. Sloane looked at him. Then we make sure Hargrove is protected before we run this. Damon said, that requires telling Hargrove the full extent of the internal situation. I know, Sloane said, which means extending trust to a board member we've known for 4 days. We extended trust to Harland for 9 years, she said, without inflection. I'd say our track record on long acquaintance isn't significantly better than our track record on short. The silence that followed was not comfortable. It was the kind of silence that happens when someone has said a true thing that is also a hard thing, and the person receiving it is deciding whether to push back or absorb it. Damon absorbed it. I'll call Hargrove, he said. I'll call Hargrove, Sloane said. He responds better to me. She made the call from the corridor outside the communications room, standing with her back against the stone wall and her free hand pressed flat against her thigh. Hargrove answered on the second ring. She explained the situation in precise, non-sensationalized language, watching her own voice for any tremor she'd have to account for. Finding none, Hargrove asked 4 questions. She answered all of them accurately. He was quiet for a moment. You're asking me to be a tripwire, Hargrove said. I'm asking you to be a witness, Sloane said. If a contact comes, you document it and report it to me within the hour. That's the entirety of what I'm asking. And if it comes in a form I don't recognize as a contact, Hargrove said. It won't, Sloane said. Roman Greco is too good to be subtle when he's in a hurry. He'll make it legible. Hargrove was quiet for another moment. Then he said, send me a secure contact number. Not the main line. Already sent, Sloane said, because Ree had set up the secure channel that morning, and she'd had the number in her phone for 6 hours. She ended the call, stood in the corridor, breathed. The piece of information she needed to feed to Calloway was specific. She needed it to be verifiable enough to be credible, false enough to be controllable, and urgent enough to prompt immediate action rather than calculation. Wrote 4 versions in her head, discarded 3, and took the 4th to Damon. He read it on her phone screen and then looked up. This implies, I'm not certain about the remediation disclosure. It implies you're not certain the disclosure was complete, she said. That's a different implication. Roman will use it. Roman will try to use it, she said. We'll be watching when he does. Damon handed the phone back. His fingers brushed hers in the exchange brief. Incidental, neither of them acknowledged it. Do it, he said. She spent 20 minutes engineering the delivery. Not directly to Calloway, too obvious. She went through Davis, the younger communications team member she'd identified on day 1, as genuinely talented, and she told Davis a partial version of a concern she was having about the board meeting preparation, in language casual enough to suggest she was thinking aloud rather than briefing. She watched Davis absorb it and understood that Davis was exactly good-natured and professional, enough to mention it to a senior colleague in the way people mention things they're not sure are significant. Calloway was Davis's senior colleague. By 3 in the afternoon, Sloane's secure monitoring Reyes and his team, working through channels she'd been given provisional access to, showed an outgoing communication from Calloway's personal device to a number that traced to a registered contact of Roman Greco's legal team. 14 minutes later, Hargrove called the secure number. Someone just reached out through my personal attorney's office, Hargrove said, represented as a potential business opportunity. The language used was specific to the concern you described. Sloane said, thank you, Hargrove. Don't respond. Don't contact the attorney. I'll explain the next step within the hour. She ended the call. She stood in the middle of her office with the phone in her hand and the confirmed intelligence in her head and the specific sensation of holding something that had just become significantly more complicated than it had been that morning. Because the contact to Hargrove had come through his personal attorney's office, which meant Roman Greco had a line into Hargrove's personal attorney's communications, which meant Roman's reach inside the legal infrastructure surrounding the Bellucci Group's board was broader than Harland. Much broader. She brought this to Damon. He listened. His expression, through the first 30 seconds, was controlled. Through the next 10 seconds, something shifted in it, not collapse. But the particular compressed intensity of someone who has just understood that the thing they've been fighting is larger than the shape they'd been fighting it in. He's been building this for years, Damon said. Longer than Victor, Sloane said. Victor is the succession play. Roman is the infrastructure play. Victor gets the shares if the charter clause fails. Roman gets the group if the legal and reputational infrastructure collapses. She looked at him. They're running parallel operations. Victor gets what's on paper. Roman gets what actually functions. They're splitting the organization, Damon said. They're dismantling it, Sloane said, and handing each other the pieces they want. Damon stood at the window. His hands were at his sides. His jaw had done the thing it did when he was managing something enormous, behind a face that showed very little, but this time she could see the cost of the management, could see the weight of 11 years of building, and the specific devastation of discovering the foundation had been worked on by someone else for most of that time. She let him have a moment with it, not out of deference, out of the practical understanding that she needed him to process it rather than act from the middle of it. Then she said, Damon. He turned. The board meeting is tomorrow, she said. Roman expects us to walk in, compromised, weakened by the Fen piece, the formal challenge, and now whatever he plans to do with the Hargrove approach. He expects us to be defensive. She looked at him steadily. We're not going to be defensive. We have a legal challenge on the table, Damon said. We have an infiltrated communications team. We have a missing legal soul and a board member whose attorney's office is compromised. What are we going to be if not defensive? Offensive, Sloane said for the second time since she'd walked into his life. But this time we have something we didn't have 2 days ago. What? We have the map, she said. Roman gave it to us. He showed us exactly where his infrastructure runs the Callaway. Channel, Hargrove's attorney. Harlan's access, net, because he was using all of it. And now we know every line of it. She looked at him. What we do next is use that map to walk into that board meeting with everything he thought he'd hidden, laid out in front of the board before Roman can frame it. Damon was very still. You're talking about exposing Roman's operation publicly, in front of the board. I'm talking about making Roman's operation the story, she said, instead of ours. She could see him thinking through it. The speed and quality of his thinking was something she'd come to respect in the past 4 days, in a way that was distinct from anything she'd respected before. Because it was not the thinking of someone making safe decisions, but the thinking of someone genuinely calculating from incomplete information under pressure and doing it accurately. The board members who are already on Roman's side won't support this, he said. No, she agreed. But we don't need them. We need Castellan, Hargrove, and the 2 undecideds. That's 3 of 5. 3 of 5 carries tomorrow. Castellan is solid, Damon said. Hargrove just participated in an intelligence operation against the man who tried to use his attorney to reach him, Sloane said. He's not an undecided anymore. Damon looked at her. A long look, the kind that had stopped making her uncomfortable 3 days ago, and had started making her feel something different that she wasn't examining too closely. This fails, he said quietly. If we go in tomorrow and it doesn't hold. I know, Sloane said. The group is gone, he said. Victor gets the shares. Roman gets the operations. I get nothing. I know, she said again. And you, he said. If this falls apart, you're Mrs. Bellucci in a marriage that just became significantly more complicated than the contract anticipated. She looked at him. Then it better not fall apart. He held her gaze for a moment. Then something in his face shifted briefly, barely perceptibly, into something that was neither management nor calculation, but something more interior and more human. I'll get Reyes to start pulling everything we have on the Callaway channel, he said. And his voice was steady, and she knew that the decision had been made. She went back to her desk. She had 12 hours to build the case that would either hold the Bellucci group together or confirm that she had walked out of one collapsing life and directly into another, with nothing to show for it except the particular knowledge of exactly how the collapse had happened. She opened her laptop. She started building. She worked through the night without sleeping. Not the romantic version of working through the night, not with cold coffee going warm and the satisfying accumulation of breakthrough after breakthrough. The actual version, the kind where your eyes start doing things at 2 in the morning that require you to blink hard and look away from the screen, where your lower back develops a specific point of pain around 3 that you ignore until it's not ignorable, where the thoughts that were sharp at midnight start fraying at the edges by 4, and you have to slow down because a mistake made from exhaustion is worse than no move at all. Sloane slowed down when she needed to. She got up, walked the length of her office 4 times, drank water, sat back down, and kept going. Reyes had given her access to the Callaway's channel intercepts. The material was dense and technical and required her to run 3 separate searches through the Bellucci group's internal financial records to make sense of the communication patterns the way a sequence of apparently unrelated message exchanges, when overlaid against specific dates in the group's public communication history, revealed a timing correlation so precise that coincidence became structurally impossible. Every defensive failure in the Bellucci group's public communications over the past 7 years had been preceded, within 48 hours, by an outgoing communication from Callaway's personal device. Every single one. She printed the overlay. She laid it flat on the desk and looked at it and felt the particular cold clarity that comes when a pattern reveals itself fully, not the satisfaction of solving something, but the specific weight of understanding how. Long something has been true without anyone seeing it. She built the presentation around this overlay. Not a slide deck. She didn't want anything that could be dismissed as constructed. She built a document, clean, chronological, every claim sourced to an original record, every inference labeled as inference and distinguished from the documented facts. She knew from 11 years of communication work that the most dangerous document you can put in front of a hostile audience is one that is so precisely organized that attacking it requires attacking the sources rather than the conclusions, because attacking the sources means admitting you've read them. She finished at 6:41. She read the whole thing from the beginning. She changed 9 words. She sent it to Ree with instructions to review for legal exposure before 7:30. Ree responded at 7:18 clean. Send it. She printed 6 copies, put them in a folder, went to shower and dress, and come back to herself, enough to walk into the most important room she'd walked into in her professional life. Damon was in the hall when she came downstairs. He looked at her in the particular way he'd developed over the past 4 days, not assessing anymore, something more direct than that. You didn't sleep, he said. Neither did you, she said. I slept 2 hours. I slept none. I'm still functional. She held up the folder. It's all here. He took it from her. He read standing in the hall, which she'd come to understand was a thing he did when he was reading something he needed to absorb quickly. He thought better when he could move slightly, shift his weight, the minimal physical activity, keeping his mind from going static. He read for 8 minutes without speaking. She watched him read. When he looked up, his expression was very controlled. This is enough. It's enough if the board is reading in good faith, she said. It's not enough if 2 of them are already in Roman's pocket. 2 of them are, Damon said, Morrison and Cade. I've known it for months. I couldn't prove it. Then we need 3, Sloane said. Castellan, Hargrove, and 1 undecided. The undecided is Park, Damon said. Cautious. She doesn't take risks. She doesn't take risks she can't see the edges of, Sloane said. If we give her a risk with clear edges, we show her the document, Damon said. We show her the document, Sloane confirmed. Before the meeting, 15 minutes before. Enough time to read it, not enough time to be worked on by Morrison or Cade. Damon looked at her. You've been planning the sequencing. I've been planning everything, she said. That's what I do. He nodded once. His jaw was set. He looked the way she imagined people look when they've arrived at something they've been building toward for a long time, and the arrival is not relief, but the specific heightened alertness of someone about to step into something they know will cost them regardless of outcome. Go, he said. The board meeting was scheduled for 10 at the Bellucci Group's headquarters, the legitimate 122 floors, in a building that had been acquired in 2003 and renovated twice, kind of corporate address that said, "We have been here, and we are staying." The boardroom was on the top floor. Glass walls on two sides, the city visible below in the particular flat morning light of a day that hadn't decided what it was going to be yet. They arrived at 9:30. Reyes and two other personnel cleared the floor. Perrin coordinated the logistics. Sloane went to the small conference room adjacent to the boardroom and waited. Park arrived at 9:44. She was a precise woman, early 60s. The posture of someone who had spent decades in rooms where precision was the admission price. She looked at Sloane when she came in, and then at the folder on the table, and then back at Sloane. "Damon said you wanted to brief me," she said. "Sit down," Sloane said. Park sat. Sloane slid the document across the table. Park read. She read the way. Good minds read not passively, but with a quality of active engagement that you could see in the slight movement of her eyes and the stillness of everything else. She turned the pages with deliberate care. When she reached the Callaway overlay, she stopped. She looked at it for a long moment. "This is a 7-year timeline," she said. "Yes," Sloane said. "How confident are you in the correlation?" "Every event on that timeline is documented from primary sources," Sloane said. "Correlation doesn't prove intent. It doesn't need to. Communication records prove intent independently." Park looked up. "The communication records are from Callaway's personal device, obtained through legal intercept, coordinated through Chambers," Sloane said. "The methodology is clean. The chain of custody is documented." Park looked at her for a moment. Not warmly. Park didn't appear to do warmth as a primary register, but with the specific quality of someone who is recalibrating their assessment of a person in real time and letting the process show enough that it was visible. "Morrison will challenge the intercept method," Park said. "Morrison will challenge everything," Sloane said. "That's his role today. What I'm asking you to consider is not whether Morrison challenges this, but whether the document, taken as a whole, changes your read on what's happened to this organization over 7 years." Park was quiet for a moment. "It changes it," she said. "Then that's what matters," Sloane said. Park stood up, straightened her jacket. She looked at the document one more time, not reading it, just looking at it the way you look at something when you're fixing it in your memory. Then she left. Sloane sat in the conference room for 90 seconds. She pressed her palms flat on the table and felt the cool solidity of it and breathed once, carefully, and then stood up and went to join Damon in the hall. "Park," he said. "Park," she confirmed. They went into the boardroom. The room arranged itself the way rooms arrange themselves when everyone in them is managing something significant. Morrison and Cade took their seats on the far side of the table with the particular ease of people who believe they already know how the next 2 hours end. Victor Bellucci was there not as a board member, but as a representative of the family trust, which entitled him to attend. He sat to the right of Morrison in a charcoal suit and looked at Sloane the way he'd looked at her in the compound hall mapping, evaluating, measuring the seams. She looked back at him without adjusting anything. Roman Greco was not in the room. She'd expected this. Roman Greco was never in the room. He was always somewhere at the end of a line, being pulled by someone in the room. The board chair, a quiet man named Ash, who'd held the position for 6 years, and had, as far as Sloane could determine, maintained a studied neutrality that was either principled or convenient, called the meeting to order. Damon spoke first. He presented the remediation timeline, clean and direct, without defensiveness. He acknowledged the historical structure without minimizing it and established the 11-year arc of legitimate restructuring with the particular authority of someone who has built something and knows every brick of it. Morrison interrupted 4 times. Each interruption was a version of the same move, using precise language to imply a totality of corruption from a specific instance of it. Each time, Sloane watched Damon take the interruption, let it land, and respond with a factual correction that was more specific than Morrison's challenge, and therefore more credible. She'd prepped him for every version of this exchange the previous evening, and she watched him execute it with the controlled aggression of someone who'd been underestimated for long enough that being underestimated no longer affected him. Cade didn't interrupt. He made notes. This was more dangerous than Morrison's interruptions, because what Cade was doing was building a record, and Sloane needed to know what was in his notes before the meeting ended. 20 minutes in, Ash said, "Ms. Bellucci, you authored the remediation statement that was released publicly. I'd like to hear your assessment of the formal challenge that's been filed." She'd been waiting for this. She stood up. She presented the document. Not the whole thing, she knew better than to read a document to a room. She walked them through the architecture of it, the Callaway Communications timeline, the correlation with public communication failures, the source of the formal challenge documentation, and the line from Harlan's download to Roman Greco's filing. She was precise and she was fast, because the room had a limited tolerance for detail before it started looking for exits, and she needed to get through the architecture before Morrison found his first interruption. He found it at the 7-minute mark. The Callaway intercept is not admissible in a regulatory proceeding. "I'm not presenting it for regulatory admissibility," Sloane said. "I'm presenting it for board comprehension of a pattern. The regulatory proceeding is a separate matter. What I'm asking this board to consider is whether the formal challenge filed against the group's remediation statement was filed with information obtained through a 7-year infiltration of its communications infrastructure." She looked directly at Morrison. "You're welcome to challenge the intercept's admissibility in the regulatory forum. That's appropriate. What's not appropriate is using that challenge to prevent this board from understanding what's been happening inside its own organization." Morrison's face had done something brief and uncontrolled. He recovered it quickly. "These are serious allegations. They're documented observations," Sloane said. "The allegations are yours to form from the documentation." Victor said, from the right side of the table, "This is a very polished presentation for a woman who's been in this organization for 6 days." The room shifted slightly. She felt it. She looked at Victor. "I've been in this organization for 6 days," she said. "In that time, I've identified a 7-year communications infiltration, a compromised legal counsel, a network of shell company documentation, connecting your operations to the systematic suppression of legitimate board oversight, and a coordinated strategy between your office and Roman Greco's to split the group's assets through parallel legal and reputational channels." She paused. 6 days is apparently enough. Victor's expression didn't change, but something behind it moved, and what moved was the thing that had been managing the expression, and for a brief moment she saw what was underneath. Not the pleasant camouflage, not the mapping quality, but something older and harder and genuinely angry. "You're making a very dangerous claim," he said quietly. "I'm making a very documented claim," she said equally quietly. "The danger in it is yours, not mine," Ash said. "We'll take a 15-minute recess." The room moved. Castellan caught Sloane's eye as she stood, a small nod, contained, communicating nothing except, "I see what you're doing, and I'm with you." Park gathered her papers without looking at anyone, which Sloane read as someone who was thinking, rather than signaling, which was fine. Hargrove stood and came around the table and said, low, for her ear only, "He tried to reach me again this morning. Different channel. I documented it." "Give it to Ree," she said. "Already did," Hargrove said, and moved away. In the corridor, Morrison went directly to Victor. She watched them from the glass wall, the tight, rapid quality of their conversation, the way Morrison's hands moved and Victor's didn't, the way Victor listened with the stillness of someone who was recalculating rather than reacting. Damon came to stand beside her. His shoulder was close to hers. "Victor's rattled," he said. "Victor's thinking," she said. "Rattled would be better. What's the difference?" "Rattled people make predictable mistakes," she said. "People who are thinking make unpredictable ones." She watched Victor pull his phone from his jacket. He looked at the screen. Something crossed his face, brief and contained, but she'd been watching his face for 6 days, and she caught it. "He just got a message," she said. "From Roman," Damon said. "Almost certainly," she said. "The question is what Roman is telling him." They found out 17 minutes later, when the board reconvened and Ash called for the preliminary vote. on the remediation endorsement, the vote that would determine whether the board stood behind the Bellucci Group statement or allowed the formal challenge to proceed without. Organizational support, which would effectively hand Roman the tool he needed to dismantle the remediation timeline's legal standing. Morrison voted against. Cade voted against. Castellan voted for. Hargrove voted for. Park voted for. 3-2, the vote carried. Morrison was already standing. I'm requesting an independent audit of the materials presented today before any formal board statement is issued. Seconded, Cade said. The motion for audit is noted, Ash said. Doesn't reverse the vote. It suspends its effect pending independent review, Morrison said. Sloane said, on what procedural basis? Morrison looked at her. The look had changed, no longer the condescension of the first hour, but something harder. Something that had decided she was worth the full weight of his opposition. Charter Provision 14, subsection C. A board vote on matters of legal significance can be suspended for independent review if two board members request it within the same session. She knew Provision 14. She'd read the charter twice. She knew subsection C. She also knew subsection D, which Morrison had not cited, presumably because he was hoping she hadn't read it. Subsection D, she said. Independent review suspension requires the requesting members to have no direct financial interest in the outcome of the reviewed matter. Would you like to discuss your final interest in the outcome of this matter, Mr. Morrison? Because I have documentation of the interest if the board would like to see it. The silence that followed was the loudest silence she'd been in since the penthouse. Morrison's face went through 3 expressions in quick succession. The third one stayed. A careful managed blankness that was the face of someone who has just understood they've walked into something they didn't see. That's a significant allegation, Ash said. I have documentation, Sloane said. I'd prefer not to present it publicly in this room. Think Mr. Morrison might prefer that too. Morrison said nothing. Cade said nothing. Victor, across the table, was very still. I'm going to suggest, Ash said slowly, that the suspension request be tabled pending a review of the documentation. Miss Bellucci references. Out of session. He looked at Morrison. If the documentation is as she represents it. It is, Sloane said. Morrison sat down. Slowly. The particular quality of a man sitting down when he has calculated that standing is no longer the dominant position. The meeting ended 12 minutes later. Ash confirmed the vote was binding, pending the documentation review. Castellan left quickly, pressing Sloane's hand once as she passed. Park left without contact. Parker paused at the door and said, "Good work," in the voice of someone who doesn't say it unless they mean it. Morrison and Cade left together. She watched them go. Victor was the last to leave. He stood at the far end of the table, and when the room was otherwise empty, he looked at Sloane across the length of it. Pleasant camouflage was entirely gone. What was under it was what she'd glimpsed earlier, the old, hard, genuine thing. "You've bought yourselves a meeting," he said. "Not the war." "I know," she said. "Roman doesn't stop," Victor said. "He's not built like that." "Neither am I," she said. Victor looked at her for a moment, then at Damon. Then he picked up his jacket and left. The door closed. Damon stood at the window, with his hands at his sides and his back to the room, and looked at the city below for a long time. She didn't interrupt it. He sat at the table and let the room settle, and felt the exhaustion depriving, for the first time, the full weight of 23 hours, without sleep, and the sustained adrenaline of the morning, dropping away and leaving behind it specific heaviness of a body that has been pushed past what it wanted to do, and has complied and is now submitting an invoice. "You had Morrison's financial interest documentation this whole time," Damon said, not turning around. "Since yesterday afternoon," she said. "Reyes's team pulled it as part of the intercept analysis. You held it. I needed it for the right moment," she said. The right moment was when he tried to invoke procedural suspension. Before that, it was a weapon we'd already fired. After that, it was a different conversation entirely. Damon turned. He looked at her across the table with an expression that was not managed at all, something more direct, more unguarded, more in the register of something she recognized from the study at 1 in the morning, with the cooling coffee and the city moving in the feeds outside. "We held it," he said. "We held it," she agreed. He came to the table. He sat across from her, not in the chair at the far end, but the one directly across, close enough that she could see the particular quality of tiredness in his face, and the line of tension along his jaw that hadn't fully released yet, and the small scar through his left eyebrow that was very old and caught the light. The documentation review, he said. Morrison's interest. How does that play out? Ash takes it out of session, she said. Morrison's position on the board becomes untenable. He resigns or he's removed either way. Victor loses a vote, which changes the board composition before the formal charter confirmation. Charter confirmation is in 3 weeks, Damon said. I know, she said. 3 weeks is enough time. Roman's formal challenge is still active, he said. Roman's formal challenge is built on documentation he obtained through a compromised legal counsel who left the organization without authorization, she said. Ree is preparing the challenge to the challenge. It'll take time, but the evidentiary problem is his, not ours. Damon was quiet for a moment. Then, what does Roman do next? Sloane had been thinking about this since 3 in the morning, in the part of her mind that ran separately from the immediate problem, the part that was always looking 2 moves ahead. He escalates, she said. The legal and reputational strategy has stalled. Victor's board position is compromised. The formal challenge has a problem. She looked at Damon. He has one resource left that he hasn't deployed directly. What resource, she said. Damon's expression sharpened. He's been building a file, she said. Not on the group on me. He's been building it since the night of the party. Before that, probably since the contract was signed. Everything about my history, my connection to Evan, my previous financial situation, the cross-financial relationship. She looked at the table. Roman's going to deploy that file. Not through a journalist. Fenn's piece has already run and been countered. He'll deploy it in a setting where it can't be contexted in real time. The annual council gathering, Damon said quietly. She looked up. It's in 4 days, he said. Every significant power holder in the city. The board, the Commerce Authority, legal leadership, financial sector. Roman is a member. So is Victor, his jaw tightened. The one setting where a public humiliation can't be managed from the outside because the audience is inside the room. Do it there, Sloane said. Whatever he has, he's going to use it in front of that room. Then we don't go, Damon said. If we don't go, the absence reads as exactly what he wants it to read as, she said. We go. Sloane, we go, she said, more firmly, and we go prepared. Whatever he has on me, I'd rather face it in a room I can see than in a coverage cycle I can't. Damon looked at her. The directness in his expression was doing something she was starting to recognize as a recurring problem for her equanimity. Not the look itself, but the quality of it. The specific absence of performance. The way it said, I see you, and meant exactly that, without decoration. He's going to try to humiliate you, Damon said, publicly, in a room full of people whose opinion matters. I know, she said, and you want to walk into that room. I want to walk into that room already knowing what he has, she said. It's different from walking in blind. She looked at him steadily. I need access to everything the Callaway Channel shows about Roman's operations in the last 8 months. And I need to know if Evan Cross has been in contact with Roman's team. Damon went very still. Why Evan? Because Roman needed an origin story for whatever file he's building on me, she said. And the most compelling origin story is the one that starts with a woman who walked out of one man's life and directly into a contract with another. The most compelling version of that story requires a witness from the first part, someone who can speak to who I was before. She looked at him. Evan has every reason to cooperate with Roman. His financial fraud exposure is still active. He needs a deal, and the deal Roman can offer him is better than anything the Commerce Authority will. Damon's expression had gone through several things in quick succession and arrived at something cold and precise. I'll get you the access, he said. Today, she said. Today, he confirmed. She stood up. Her legs were less reliable than usual, exhaustion making itself known in the specific way of the body asserting its terms after being ignored for too long. She steadied herself against the table for a moment, one hand flat on the surface, and breathed. Damon noticed. She knew. He noticed because he was the kind of person who noticed everything and did not always respond visibly. But he came around the table and stood close enough that she was aware of his presence in the particular way you become aware of someone who has stopped being an abstract entity in your calculations and become a person you are physically affected by. She straightened up, took her hand off the table. I'm fine. You slept nothing, he said. I know, she said. That's going to catch up with you before the council gathering. I'll sleep tonight, she said. I'll sleep for 8 hours and I'll wake up and I'll be fine. And if Roman moves before the council gathering, Damon said, then we deal with it, she said. That's all. We deal with it. He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, with a quietness that was different from his usual quietness, not controlled, not managed, but the quietness of someone who is saying something they've been sitting with for longer than the words suggest. When this is done, whatever done looks like, you don't have to stay. She understood what he was saying. He was saying, the contract has terms, and the terms are fair, and when this is over, you can leave, and I will not make it complicated. He was saying it as a kindness. She looked at him. She thought about the ring spinning across the marble floor. She thought about the man on the ground, and her hands pressing the compress and the certainty she'd manufactured for his benefit. He needed it. She thought about 1 in the morning, in the study with cooling coffee, and the feeds shifting around them, and the way she'd felt not safe, exactly, but not alone in a way she recognized as being different from every room she'd been in for the last 4 years. I know, she said. She left the boardroom and went to find Reyes to get the access she needed. She did not think about what she hadn't said. Downstairs, in the building's lobby, Calloway was walking toward the exit. He didn't know she'd seen him. She'd come down the service stairs rather than the main elevator. A habit Reyes had established for her 3 days ago, on the grounds that predictable movements created predictable vulnerabilities. She watched him through the interior glass of the stairwell door. He was on his phone. His posture had the particular compression of someone delivering urgent information in a space where they thought they were alone. She watched him until he reached the exit. Then she called Reyes. Calloway just left the building, she said. Personal device, active call. I need to know who he called and what he said. On it, Reyes said, and then a pause. There's something else. Something in his voice. Specific quality she hadn't heard from him before, not alarm exactly, but the kind of care in a voice that signals the next sentence is information the listener is going to need time with. Tell me, she said. Evan Cross, Reyes said. He arrived in the city this morning. He checked into a hotel 4 blocks from the council gathering venue. A pause. He had a 2-hour meeting this morning with Roman Greco's legal team. Sloane stood in the stairwell with the phone against her ear, and the sounds of the building around her and the cold fact of what Reyes had just said settling into the place where she kept the things she needed to operate from. Evan was in the city. Evan had met with Roman, which meant the file was already assembled, the testimony already arranged, the weapon already loaded, and aimed at the one thing Sloane had been building for the past 6 days, the identity she'd been constructing inside the Bellucci group, brick by careful brick, from the foundation up. And in 4 days, in a room full of every person who mattered in this city, Roman Greco was going to pull the trigger with her ex-fiancé standing beside him as the evidence. Reyes, she said. Yeah, he said. She looked at the exit where Calloway had gone. She looked at the lobby. She looked at the city through the lobby glass, the particular flat morning light that still hadn't decided what it was going to be. I need everything you have on Evan Cross, she said. She slept for 8 hours exactly, not because she was at peace, she wasn't, but because she had learned years ago that the body is a tool and tools require maintenance, and a tool maintained poorly at the moment it is needed most fails in the specific way that cannot be recovered from. She set her alarm, closed her eyes, was unconscious within minutes, with the efficiency of someone who has made a deliberate decision rather than drifted into rest. She woke at 6 in the morning with Evan Cross's file on her phone and 4 days, until the council gathering compressed into something that felt much smaller. She read the file in bed, in the gray early light, with the particular attention she gave to things that required her to be both precise and honest with herself simultaneously. Reyes's team had been thorough. The file on Evan covered his financial fraud exposure, in full the Commerce Authority investigation, the preliminary findings, The 3 counts of securities misrepresentation that his legal team had been quietly negotiating for 6 weeks. The deal he'd been offered was not favorable. The deal Roman Greco was apparently offering him in exchange for testimony at the council, gathering about Sloane's character, history, and the alleged mercenary nature of her marriage, was significantly better. She read every page. She read the part about herself without flinching, which required a specific interior effort she acknowledged and then set aside. The narrative Evan would deliver already drafted. Reyes had obtained a preliminary version, was not fabricated. That was the worst of it. It was selectively accurate in the way Roman had perfected, true elements arranged to point in a false direction. He would say she had spent 4 years exploiting his professional connections. He would say she had built her career on relationships he'd provided access to. He would say the contract marriage was consistent with a pattern, a woman who had always moved through men's professional ecosystems and extracted value before moving on. He would frame her entire history as a sequence of calculated transactions rather than a sequence of actual work. None of this was provable as false, because the true version and the false version shared the same surface facts. The difference between them lived in the interpretation, and interpretation was Roman's weapon of choice. She set the phone down. She sat in the gray light for a moment. She thought about the specific unfairness of a world in which the accurate version of your life and the false version of it can look identical from outside, and where the person with the louder platform gets to decide which version becomes the one people remember. Then she got up and started working. The 4 days before the council gathering were the most operationally dense of anything she'd managed in 11 years of professional life. She ran 3 tracks simultaneously. The Morrison documentation review, which Ash was coordinating through an independent examiner she'd suggested and he'd accepted. The preparation of a counterposition on Roman's formal challenge, which Ree was building with a precision that Sloane reviewed daily and adjusted twice. And the specific preparation for the council gathering itself, which she conducted alone. In her office, in the early morning hours before the compound woke up, because what she was building for that room required a kind of thinking she could only do in silence. She talked to Petra every day. She talked to Davis. She talked to Hargrove twice. She did not talk to anyone about Evan. On the 3rd day, Damon knocked on her office door at 11 in the evening. She was at her desk. She'd been at her desk since 7 that morning, with a 2-hour break at midday that she'd spent walking the compound's perimeter, not for exercise, but because movement helped her think, and she'd needed to think through a structural problem in the council presentation that wasn't resolving from a seated position. Damon came in and sat down across from her without asking. He'd stopped asking. She'd stopped needing him, too. Morrison resigned from the board this afternoon, he said. She looked up. Ash's examiner found the financial interest. Found it and documented it, Damon said. Morrison's legal team tried to negotiate the terms of the resignation. Ash gave them 24 hours. They accepted. And Cade, she said. Cade is waiting to see what happens at the gathering, Damon said. He's not resigning, but he's not actively opposing anymore. He's calculating. Calculating people are manageable, she said. They follow outcomes. Yes, Damon said. He looked at her desk. At the documents laid out in the particular organized density that was her working method, not messy, but compressed, everything within reach, because everything was being used. What are you building? She told him. She told him the whole architecture of what she planned to walk into the council gathering with. She watched him listen with the quality of attention she'd come to rely on more than she'd anticipated, the kind that processed accurately, and asked good questions afterward. He asked 2 questions. She answered them. He was quiet for a moment. Evan is going to be in that room, he said. I know, she said. And you're going to stand in the same room with him and do this. I'm going to stand in the same room with him and do this, she confirmed. Damon looked at her. Something in his expression had the particular quality of a person who wants to say something and is making a deliberate choice about whether to say it. She watched the choice happen. Whatever he says about you, Damon said finally, in that room, I need you to know that I know what I've seen in 6 days, and what I've seen is not the person he's going to describe. She held his gaze, the specific weight of what he'd just said, not a declaration, not a performance, Just a plain statement of direct observation from a man who didn't speak unless he meant it settled into her with solidity that she hadn't expected and took a moment to process. "Thank you," she said. She went back to work. He stayed in the room for another 40 minutes, reading something from his own phone, not talking. She didn't ask him to leave. The silence was the particular kind that had developed between them over the past 10 days. Not the silence of absence, but the silence of two people who had run out of the need to fill space and had arrived somewhere, quieter and more functional on the other side of it. When he left, he didn't say goodnight. He just left. She listened to his footsteps down the corridor, and then the quiet, and then she worked until 2 in the morning and went to sleep. The council gathering was held in a ballroom at the city's oldest private club, a building that had been the locus of the city's power for 90 years. All marble floors and coffered ceilings, and the specific smell of old money and prolonged ambition. Sloane had been in it twice before, both times as Evan's companion, both times in the role of the person who held the space he'd left behind. She arrived with Damon at 7:45, 15 minutes before the formal proceedings began. She wore black, not the performative black of someone in mourning or making a statement, but the plain excellent black of someone who wanted nothing about her appearance to be the most interesting thing in the room. Her hair was back. Her jewelry was minimal. She looked exactly like what she was, a woman who had done the work and was there to let the work speak. Damon walked beside her, not ahead, not behind, beside. She felt the room adjust when they walked in. Not dramatically, the people in this room were too sophisticated for dramatic reactions. But she felt it in the small, collective recalibration of attention, a slight shift in conversational volume, the specific quality of eyes that move to a new point of focus and stay there a beat longer than is strictly casual. She was aware of Castellan across the room, who raised her chin almost imperceptibly. She was aware of Hargrove, who met her eyes and nodded once. She was aware of Park, who did not look at her at all, which she read as concentration rather than distance. She was aware of Victor at the far end of the room, standing with two men she didn't recognize, and Roman Greco. Roman Greco in person was smaller than she'd constructed him in her mind. This was almost always true of people you'd been building a picture of. From documentation, the documents were the size of the impact, and the person was just a person. He was 60 or thereabouts, compact, with the kind of stillness that comes not from calm but from the deliberate suppression of constant internal activity. He looked at her the way someone looks at a problem they've been working on and are confident they've solved. She looked back at him with the specific expression of someone who has read every document he's generated in the past 8 months and is deciding which one to start with. He looked away first. Evan was at the bar. She saw him before he saw her, which gave her approximately 3 seconds to absorb the fact of him before having to perform anything. He looked the way people look when they've been under sustained legal and professional pressure for 6 weeks, without the particular armor that money and status usually provide, thinner, kind of thinness that comes from stress rather than intention. A quality around his eyes that she recognized as someone who wasn't sleeping the way he used to. He was holding a drink, he wasn't drinking. His shoulders were set in the particular way of someone braced for something. He saw her. The look on his face in the first half-second was not what she'd expected. She'd been prepared for hostility, or for the specific bravado of someone who has committed to a course and is performing certainty about it. What she saw instead, very briefly, before he managed it into something else, was something closer to the look of a person who has done a specific thing they cannot undo, and has been living with the knowledge of having done it. She nodded at him, a single small nod, not warmth, not hostility, just acknowledgement. I see you and I know what you're here to do, and I am not afraid of it. He looked away. The formal proceedings began at 8. Ash presided. He was the board chair of the Commerce Authority Oversight Committee, which put him in the chair for this gathering as well, a fact Sloane had verified 3 weeks ago when she'd first mapped the room's power structure. The evening's agenda was standard, quarterly reports from 4 major organizations, a presentation on the harbor development, and an open forum that Roman had presumably arranged to use as his vehicle. She sat through the quarterly reports with the patience of someone who is not actually waiting but is using the time. She listened to the harbor development presentation and noted 3 things she'd follow up on after tonight. Kept her hands in her lap and her posture still and her expression neutral in the way of someone who is managing a very large internal temperature without letting it affect anything visible. Roman moved during the open forum. He was smooth about it. Smooth in the way of someone who has run this kind of operation many times and has developed the specific skill of making a coordinated attack look like a spontaneous concern. He rose and spoke about the importance of integrity in the organizations represented in the room, about the duty of the gathering to hold its members to a standard of transparency. He spoke about the Bellucci Group's remediation statement and the formal challenge pending against it. He spoke with the measured authority of someone presenting evidence rather than argument. Then he said, I think it's important for this gathering to hear from someone with direct personal knowledge of the character and methods of the individuals involved. With the gathering's indulgence, I'd like to invite Evan Cross to speak. Evan stood. Sloane had not moved. She did not move now. She felt Damon beside her, not a touch, not a gesture, just the physical fact of his presence beside her, steady and unmoving, as everything in the room shifted its attention to the man at the bar who was now walking toward the center of the floor. Evan spoke for 4 minutes. She listened to every word. She'd read the prepared version, so she knew where he departed from it 3 places, all of them moments where he'd added something that wasn't in the draft, something that came from a different place than the strategic calculation. She filed each one. He was a good speaker. She'd always known that. He had the particular gift of sounding like he was reasoning toward a conclusion rather than delivering a prepared one, which made the conclusions feel earned. She watched the room receive it, the slight forward lean of engagement, the quality of attention that sharp pins when someone is saying something that feels genuinely personal rather than constructed. When he finished, there was a silence. Not long, 5 seconds, maybe 6. Then Ash said, "Thank you. Are there responses from the floor?" Sloane stood up. She did not look at Roman. She did not look at Victor. She looked at Ash and at the room, and she said, yes. She didn't have documents. She didn't have a presentation. She had 11 years of knowing exactly how to stand in a room full of people whose opinion mattered and speak plainly enough that the plainness itself became the argument. She said, I want to thank Mr. Cross for speaking. I'm going to respond to what he's said, and I'm going to do it the same way I've done everything in the past 10 days, which is by telling you exactly what's true and letting you assess it yourselves. She paused. She let the room settle. Everything Mr. Cross said about our relationship is accurate at the surface level, she said. I did use his professional connections to advance my career. I did operate in his ecosystem for 4 years. I did build relationships with people he introduced me to. That's all true. She looked at the room steadily. What's also true is that I spent those 4 years being the single most effective communication professional in every room I was in, producing work that generated measurable value for every organization I touched, and doing it while being consistently introduced as Evan Cross's girlfriend rather than by my professional title or my work. I was accurate about his networks. He was accurate about mine. We did not use each other equally. A silence, a different quality than before. I entered into a contract marriage with Damon Bellucci under duress of circumstances that are documented and have been publicly released by my own hand, she continued. Contract was a business arrangement, and I said so from the beginning. What I did not say, and what has since become true without my having planned for it, is that the 6 days inside that arrangement showed me what a working partnership actually looks like. When 2 people apply the stands to each other line without asking the other to be smaller to make the arrangement more comfortable. She paused. She felt the room breathing. Roman Greco has spent the past several weeks attempting to dismantle the Bellucci Group's legitimate business operations through a coordinated campaign using compromised legal counsel, a 7-year communications infiltration, formal regulatory challenge built on stolen documentation, and tonight, the testimony of a man whose cooperation was obtained through the offer of regulatory relief that Mr. Greco does not have the authority to provide. She looked at Roman directly. I have documentation of all of this. I have filed that documentation with Ash's office and with the Commerce Authority's independent examiner as of 4 this afternoon. The room had gone very still. Roman Greco's face had not changed. But his stillness had changed quality. It was no longer the stillness of suppressed activity. It was the stillness of something that has stopped. I'm not asking this gathering to make a judgment tonight, Sloane said. The documentation will speak for itself through the appropriate processes. What I am asking is that this room understand what it was nearly used for, and that the people in it consider whether the same networks that were used to coordinate this campaign have been used in other contexts that may warrant their own examination. She looked at the room, at Hargrove, who was looking back, at Castellan, whose expression was the concentrated attention of someone who had already made her decision, at Park, whose eyes were moving through the room in the rapid, precise way of someone taking inventory. That's all I have to say. She sat down. The silence lasted longer this time, long enough to be something. Then Hargrove said from his seat, I'd like to formally request that the documentation, Ms. Bella references be made available to the full gathering before any further business is conducted. Ash said, seconded by the chair. We'll take a 30-minute recess. The room moved. Roman Greco stood. He looked at Sloane across the shifting crowd, with an expression that was not hostile she'd expected hostile. What it was precisely was the expression of someone who has lost a specific engagement and is calculating how the loss affects the larger war. He held her gaze for a moment. Then he picked up his jacket and walked toward Victor's position. She watched them confer. Victor's face during the conference was not the managed pleasantness she'd learned to read it, was the older, harder thing underneath, fully exposed now, carrying a weight she recognized as the weight of something ending. Damon said quietly, beside her, Evan is leaving. She looked. Evan was at the far door, coat in hand, moving without urgency but moving. He hadn't looked at her again after she'd stood up. She'd watched him during her statement, had seen him absorb each sentence with the particular quality of someone hearing a thing they knew was true from a direction they hadn't fully anticipated. His face during the statement had done something she hadn't planned for. It had looked, briefly and genuinely, ashamed. She didn't know what to do with that. She filed it in the place where she kept things that required time rather than immediate processing. Let him go, she said. Damon looked at her. He's not the point, she said. He was a tool Roman used. That's the full extent of what he was tonight. She looked at the door where Evan had been. I'm done making him larger than that. The recess lasted 40 minutes rather than 30. Ash's team reviewed the documentation which Ree had organized for rapid transmission and which Sloane had structured specifically to be comprehensible to a non-specialist reader in under 20 minutes. She knew this because she'd tested it on Davis, who was not a specialist, and he'd understood the essential architecture in 17. When the gathering reconvened, the room was different, not in its physical arrangement, the same chairs, the same coffered ceiling, the same smell of old ambition, different in its attention. The particular reconfiguration that happens when people in a room have individually processed something significant and arrived back in the same space, carrying the weight of their individual processing simultaneously. Roman Greco did not return from the recess. Victor returned. He sat in his original position. He did not speak. Ash spoke for 12 minutes. He covered the documentation's contents, factually and without editorializing, which was its own kind of editorial. He acknowledged the ongoing regulatory processes. He confirmed that the gathering's chair would be requesting a formal review of membership in the case of any individual whose conduct was found to be materially implicated in the documented campaign. He did not name Roman Greco. He did not need to. When Ash finished, there was a moment brief, complete, the kind of moment that exists in rooms where important things have just been settled, and everyone in the room knows it simultaneously. And then Castellan began to applaud. Not the polite applause of performance, the real kind, deliberate and specific. Hargrove joined. Then Park, then, one by one, the room. Roman Greco's chair was empty. Victor's hands were in his lap. Sloane sat with her hands in her lap and let the sound wash over her without performing anything, no relief, no triumph, nothing that would look like celebration. when what she actually felt was the specific exhaustion of someone who has carried something very heavy for a very long time and has just been allowed to set it down. Damon reached over and put his hand over hers. Not dramatically, not with anything said, just the weight of his hand on hers, warm and solid and present, in a room full of people where he was making no attempt to manage what it looked like. She turned her hand over and held his. They sat like that while the room continued around them, and she was aware of nothing except the warmth of his hand, and the quiet in her own chest, and the particular sensation of having arrived somewhere she hadn't planned to arrive at, and finding, against all reasonable expectation, that it felt like solid ground. The days that followed moved differently than the days before them. Not slowly, there was still work. The operational density of everything that needed resolution didn't evaporate because one evening in a ballroom had gone a specific way. The formal challenge against the remediation statement was withdrawn by Roman's legal team within 72 hours of the gathering. Rhee's counter-challenge had been filed, and the evidentiary problem Roman faced was no longer theoretical. The Commerce Authority opened a formal investigation into the Callaway Channel 2 days later. Victor's challenge to the charter clause expired at the statutory deadline, with no viable legal support. Morrison's resignation had removed the board vote he needed, and Roman's withdrawal had removed the coordination infrastructure. The Bellucci Group's charter confirmation went through at 11:14 on a Wednesday morning, with 3 board votes in favor and 2 abstentions. Callaway resigned the same day. She didn't orchestrate it, she'd been prepared to, but he came to her office first, and she opened the door and he stood in the doorframe with the look of a man who has been carrying something for 7 years and is done carrying it. And he said, "I think you know." "I know," she said. "I want you to know I didn't," he started. "I know what you did," she said. "I know why, probably. The why doesn't change the what." She looked at him steadily. "Give Perrin your access credentials and your company devices. If you cooperate fully with the Commerce Authority investigation, the exit can be clean." He nodded. He looked at the floor for a moment. Then he looked at her. "You're very good at this," he said. "I know," she said. He left. She sat down and went back to work. Evan Cross pleaded guilty to 3 counts of securities misrepresentation 6 weeks after the gathering. The plea agreement, which Rhee had monitored through professional channels, was not as favorable as whatever Roman had offered him. Roman's offer, without Roman's freedom to honor it, had become worthless the moment the gathering ended. Evan's career was finished in any form that resembled what it had been. She read the news item about the plea once and then closed it. She thought about calling Mara. She didn't. Not because she was angry, the anger had burned itself out somewhere around day 3 in the compound, replaced by something cooler and more accurate. She didn't call because she didn't know what she would say. And she didn't know what she would say. And she didn't know what she would say because she genuinely didn't know what she wanted from Mara anymore. Forgiveness was a thing she could extend without a conversation. Understanding required information. She wasn't sure either of them had yet. She would think about Mara later, when she had the distance to think about it accurately. 3 months after the gathering, Damon's assistant, not Perrin, who had retired to a less operational role in the compound's administration, but a younger woman named Solaris, who was efficient in the specific way Sloane had come to prefer in the people. She worked closest to brought her an envelope from the group's legal department. She opened it at her desk. Inside was a certified check for $5 million and a 1-page document confirming the fulfillment of the original contract's settlement terms. She sat with it for a long moment. She picked up the check. She looked at it the way you look at something that represents a version of a story you're no longer living, not with contempt, not with sentiment, just with the accurate understanding of what it was and what it was, no longer. She put it back in the envelope. She wrote 3 words on the outside, "Return to sender." She gave it to Solaris. Solaris looked at the envelope, then at Sloane. "Should I explain?" "No explanation needed," Sloane said. "He'll understand." Damon came to her office an hour later, stood in the doorframe, the same frame she'd stood in on her first morning, looking at him reading documents with a cooled coffee nearby. She looked at him across the desk and waited. "You returned it," he said. "I don't need it," she said. "The contract entitled you to it." "I know," she said. "I'm not taking it." He came into the room. He sat down across from her, in the chair he'd occupied on and off for 3 months, and he looked at her with the expression that had stopped being managed around week 2 and had become simply his face, the way he looked when he was not performing anything and was just looking at her. "Why?" he said. She thought about how to answer this. She thought about the ring spinning across the marble floor. She thought about the man on the ground and the compress and the certainty she'd manufactured it from nothing because it was what the situation required. She thought about the night in the study with the feeds shifting and the coffee cooling and the specific sensation of working beside someone who was doing the same work without requiring her to make herself smaller to make the partnership comfortable. "Because the 5 million was for leaving," she said, "and I'm not leaving." Damon looked at her. The stillness in him was the kind she'd come to distinguish from all his other stillnesses. Not management, not calculation, not the controlled processing of a man under pressure. Just the stillness of someone who has heard a thing they needed to hear and is taking a moment to let it be true. "The contract is fulfilled," he said. "Whatever comes next isn't a contract." "I know," she said. "Whatever comes next is—" "I know," she said again. And the way she said it stopped him, because it was not impatience. It was the specific tone of someone who has already made the decision and is not interested in the ceremony of making it again. He reached across the desk. She put her hand in his. They stayed like that for a moment, just that, nothing more, the weight of his hand and the solid ground of the desk between them and the city outside the window, doing what it always did, moving and absorbing and moving on. Then Sloane straightened up, withdrew her hand, and pulled the next document toward her. "The Harbor Development Response," she said. "Petra has a draft. I want to review it before the board meeting Thursday." "The board meeting isn't until Thursday," she said, "which is 3 days from now, which is not a lot of time if the draft needs significant restructuring." She looked at him. "Do you want to review it together or separately?" Damon looked at her for a moment. Something in his face had the particular quality of a man who has just understood something, not a new fact, but the full dimension of a fact he'd had access to for a while and hadn't fully held yet. The dimension being, this was what it looked like. This was what the thing he'd been moving toward for 11 years of building alone, of managing alone, of making every decision from the position of a man who had decided attachment was a liability. This was what it looked like when it wasn't a liability. "Together," he said. She slid the draft across the desk. They worked. 6 months after that, the Bellucci Group was the subject of a lengthy profile in the city's most significant financial publication, not the investigative kind, but the profile kind they run when an organization has done something worth examining because of what it reveals about what organizations can become when they change in the right direction. Piece led with the Harbor Development Turnaround. It discussed the community programs that had been expanded under the new governance framework. It cited 3 independent analysts who said the group's legitimate business operations had not only stabilized but grown, and that the growth had come from a transparency strategy that was considered, in the financial sector, genuinely unusual. Piece mentioned Sloane Bellucci in the 3rd paragraph, and again in the 8th, and again in the conclusion. Described her as the group's head of communications and strategic development. It quoted her once. Directly, on the subject of organizational trust, she had said that trust was not a destination, but a daily practice, and that the organizations which understood this were the ones that lasted. She read the piece at her desk in the morning, before anyone else arrived, with the first coffee of the day still hot beside her. She read it the way she read everything that mattered, tracking the structure, the sourcing, the specific language. It was accurate, not the polished, partial accuracy of a piece that had been managed into existence by a communication strategy. The actual kind, the kind where the writer had done the work and the subject had told the truth, and the result resembled exactly, closely enough that you could recognize it from the inside. She set it down, looked out the window. The city was doing what it always did. She picked up the coffee. She thought about the penthouse and the ring and the corridor where she'd stood with her hands against the wall after the worst moment of the previous version of her life. She thought about the stairwell and the man on the floor and the compress, and "You're going to live," said, with a certainty that had been entirely manufactured. Thought, it turned out to be true. Not in the way she'd meant it that night, not about the man on the floor, though he'd recovered and was back at work within the month. About herself. You're going to live. The manufactured certainty that had carried her through the first steps of something she hadn't planned for, and which had turned out, in the end, to be not manufactured at all, just accurate. She heard Damon's footsteps in the corridor outside. She knew them, now, had known them for months. The particular rhythm of someone who moved with deliberate economy and never wasted motion. He pushed the door open without knocking, the way he'd stopped knocking around week 3, and he looked at her. And at the coffee, and at the publication on the desk. You've already read it, he said. 20 minutes ago, she said. And it's accurate, she said. He came in. He stood at her desk and looked at the piece, not reading it in full. He'd read it before she had. She knew, because that was the kind of person he was, the kind who read things before the moment required him to react to them. He looked at it the way you look at evidence of something you built, when you're still not entirely accustomed to the fact that it stands. The Harbor Board called this morning, he said. They want to formalize the community partnership. I know, she said. Petra told me. I've already drafted the framework. He looked at her. She looked at him. The morning light came through the window behind her and fell across the desk and across his hands and across the publication with her name in the 3rd paragraph and the 8th and the conclusion, and the city outside moved and absorbed and moved on. And in the room there was the particular quiet of 2 people who had stopped explaining themselves to each other because explanation was no longer necessary, because the thing between them had moved past the stage of requiring justification and arrived somewhere that simply was. She slid the framework draft across the desk. He picked it up. They worked. And outside, in the city that had watched all of it happen, the crash of one life and the building of another, the contract and the dissolution of the contract's meaning, the war that had been fought in boardrooms and study floors, and the marble silence of a ballroom. At night, the Bellucci group stood on ground that was solid because 2 people had fought to make it solid, together, without asking each other to be smaller. Sloane Mercer Bellucci did not destroy the people who had betrayed her. She built something in which their betrayal no longer had weight, and that, in the end, was the only victory that lasted.